The Alpha King thought he was marrying an ugly duckling until he unveiled his bride. Dominic Ashworth did not wake up that morning thinking about marriage. He woke up thinking about the quarterly earnings call he had to chair in 2 hours, the lawsuit his legal team had flagged the night before, and the cold coffee sitting on his nightstand that his housekeeper had brought at 6, and that he had forgotten to drink. Marriage was not on his mind. Marriage, for the last 34 years of his life, had been something that happened to other people, people who had the time for it, people who had the softness for it, people who were not him. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his apartment on the 31st floor and looked out at the city below. London was already awake, already moving, already doing what it did every morning with its grey sky and its crowded streets and its noise that reached him even here, even this high up, as a kind of low hum. He liked that hum. It reminded him that the world was in motion and that standing still was not an option. His phone buzzed on the desk behind him. He did not move to answer it. He already knew what it would say. His attorney, Colin Hale, had been sending him the same message every 3 days for the past 2 months. The message was always some variation of the same thing. The clock is running, Dominic. We need to talk about the clause. The clause. Dominic turned away from the window and picked up the phone. He read Colin's message, 4 sentences, direct, no unnecessary words, which was why he liked Colin, and then he set the phone back down without replying. He walked to his wardrobe, selected a suit, and got dressed in the methodical way he did everything. Left cufflink first, then right, jacket last. The clause in question was a single paragraph buried on page 47 of his grandfather's last will and testament. Edward Ashworth had built the company from a 2-room office in Manchester in 1971. He had grown it into an empire across 4 decades of decisions that were part brilliant and part terrifying, and he had controlled every piece of that empire until the day he died. Even in dying, he had found a way to keep controlling things. The will was very clear. Dominic would inherit full controlling interest in Ashworth Holdings, the company his grandfather had built, the company his father had run until his early death, the company Dominic had managed for the past 8 years only upon satisfying one personal condition. He had to be married, not engaged, married, and he had to fulfill this condition within 14 months of the date of the will's execution. That clock had started 11 months ago. He had 3 months left. Dominic sat at the long glass table in his dining room and ate breakfast, eggs, toast, black coffee, always the same, and he thought about this in the same way he thought about every problem that landed on his desk. He broke it into its components. What did he need? A wife. What did that require? A wedding. Before that, an engagement. Before that, a suitable person who was willing to enter into this arrangement with clear and mutual understanding of what it was and was not. It was not a love story. It was not a romance. It was a legal and contractual requirement, and it needed to be treated as such. His mother called while he was still at breakfast. He answered on the second ring. "You haven't spoken to Colin," she said. No greeting. Eleanor Ashworth had never believed in softening the entry to a conversation. "Good morning, mother. It is 9 in the morning and you have 3 months. Do not good morning me." Dominic set down his fork. "I'm aware of the timeline." "Then you are also aware that 3 months is not enough time for a proper engagement and a wedding unless the groundwork is already in place. Which it is not, because you have been refusing to address this." "I've been running a company." "You've been avoiding a conversation." A pause. He heard her set something down on her own table, a teacup, he guessed, with the particular click of fine china. "I'm not asking you to fall in love, Dominic. I'm asking you to make a practical decision." "That is exactly what I intend to do." "Good, then let me help you." Another pause, shorter this time. "I had lunch with Patricia Vance last week." He recognized the name. Jeffrey Vance ran a mid-size import and distribution company, respectable, established, not quite in the same league as Ashworth Holdings, but not irrelevant either. He had met Jeffrey at a few industry events over the years, and found him to be the kind of man who said the right things in the right rooms and mostly meant them. Patricia mentioned that their eldest daughter is currently unattached. His mother continued. "I don't want a matchmaking service, Mother. I'm not running a matchmaking service. I'm telling you that there are families who would understand the nature of this arrangement and treat it with appropriate discretion. The Vance family is one of them." Her voice shifted slightly, not softer but more careful. "Jeffrey has 2 daughters. The eldest is Celeste. 26, well-presented, social. She's been involved in charity work and has a background in public relations." She sounds manageable." A silence stretched out on the other end of the phone. His mother had a particular kind of silence she deployed when she found something distasteful but had decided not to say so directly. He had learned to recognize it years ago. "I'll reach out to Colin," he said. "Tell him to set up a meeting with the family." "All right," another pause. "Dominic." "Yes, try to be a human being in the meeting." He almost smiled. "I'll see what I can do." He ended the call and finished his coffee. Outside, the city kept humming. He had 3 months, a willing family, and a clear objective. He had worked with less. What no one told Dominic, what his mother had not mentioned, what Colin's careful notes had not included, was that there would be a complication. There almost always was in Dominic's experience. The complication this time came not in the form of a legal issue or a market problem or a board objection. It came in the form of a second daughter. The Vance household was not a simple place. From the outside, it presented itself as exactly what it wanted to be: a comfortable family in a comfortable home in a comfortable part of the city, with a name that opened the right doors and a reputation that had been carefully maintained over 2 generations. Jeffrey Vance was proud of what he had built. He talked about it often. He talked about it at dinner, at family gatherings, at business events, where he introduced himself with the confident handshake of a man who believed his presence was always welcome. Inside the house, things were more complicated. Celeste Vance was everything her father wanted to show the world. She was beautiful in a way that required maintenance, careful, consistent, expensive maintenance, and she was social in a way that made her useful at every event her father brought her to. She could work a room. She could remember names. She could laugh at the right moments and look interested at the right moments and excuse herself at exactly the right moment so that people were always slightly disappointed she was leaving. Jeffrey adored her. He had spent years quietly, sometimes not so quietly, making it clear that Celeste was the Vance family's finest product. Mara Vance, 2 years younger at 24, occupied a different space in the household. She had grown up in the same house, attended the same schools, sat at the same dinner table, and had somehow become, through no deliberate effort of her own, largely invisible. Not because she was unpleasant. She was not unpleasant. She was, in fact, quite intelligent, which was part of the problem. Her father had a complicated relationship with intelligence that expressed itself in women. He admired it in theory and found it inconvenient in practice. Mara had studied accounting and finance at university. She had graduated near the top of her class. She had come home afterward and quietly taken over the back-office operations of her father's company, fixing 3 years of accumulated accounting errors in her first month and reducing their overhead costs by 11% in her first year. Her father had acknowledged this by giving her a small raise and then going back to running the company the way he had always run it. He did not ask her opinion often. When he did not always take it. But the work got done, and the numbers held, and Jeffrey Vance went to his industry lunches and shook his confident handshake and felt good about his company without ever quite connecting this feeling to the person working quietly in the back office. When Alina Ashworth's interest in the family became known, when it became clear that Dominic Ashworth, the Dominic Ashworth, was looking for a wife and that the Vance family was being considered, Jeffrey had felt something shift in his chest. It was the feeling of an opportunity he hadn't expected, arriving with more weight than he knew how to hold. He had taken a long walk around his garden and thought it through. Celeste, he knew, would be the obvious choice. She was everything a man like Dominic Ashworth would want on his arm. The right look, the right manner, the right background. She was the kind of woman who photographed well at events and knew how to handle herself in a room full of powerful people. But Celeste, as of 4 months ago, was also deeply attached to a man named Oliver Grant, a documentary filmmaker she had met at a charity event who wore linen shirts and had opinions about everything and was absolutely, categorically not the kind of man Jeffrey Vance wanted in his family. Celeste was in love with Oliver. She had not said so directly, but a father knew. She had the particular brightness around her eyes when she talked about him. She avoided conversations about her future in the careful way of someone protecting a secret plan. Jeffrey could not present Celeste to the Ashworths and risk her refusing, and he could not afford to have this opportunity slip away. He looked at the back office. He thought about Mara. The conversation he had with Mara that evening was one of the shorter conversations in his memory. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table after dinner, while she was still working through a spreadsheet on her laptop, and he told her what was happening. He explained the Ashworth situation. He explained what was being considered. He told her she was being put forward as a candidate. Mara looked at him for a long moment. She closed her laptop. "You mean I'm being offered because Celeste said no?" Jeffrey shifted in his seat. "Celeste has her own situation at the moment." "You mean I'm the substitute?" He did not answer that directly. He said it was a significant opportunity. He said the Ashworth name was something that could benefit the entire family. He said she should think about what this could mean for her future. He spoke for several minutes, and at no point during those several minutes did he ask her what she wanted, or how she felt, or whether she had any objections. He had framed it as a conversation but delivered it as an announcement. Mara sat with this for a long time after he left the kitchen. She washed her cup, dried it, put it away. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark of her room and thought about what had just happened. She was 24 years old. She worked hard. She was good at her job. She had spent the last 3 years quietly holding her father's company together, and she was now being offered to a man she had never met as a second choice because the first choice was inconvenient. She thought about saying no. She turned the word over in her mind, felt its weight, considered its consequences. Her father would be disappointed, more than disappointed. He would find a way to make her feel the full size of her refusal, and she would live inside that feeling for a long time. She thought about the back office and the spreadsheets and the quiet life she had built for herself that was competent and functional and almost entirely invisible. She thought about what it might mean to step outside of it. She did not say yes that night. She did not say anything, but she also did not say no. And in the Vance household, as in many households where the balance of power ran only one direction, the absence of no was generally treated as agreement. The arrangement moved forward with the efficiency of a business transaction because that was precisely what it was. Colin Hale made contact with Jeffrey Vance's attorney. Documents were discussed. A meeting was proposed, informal, introductory, allowing both parties to assess the situation before anything was committed to paper. Dominic was told the meeting would be with Mara Vance, Jeffrey's younger daughter. He was given a brief summary: 24 years old, university-educated in finance, working in the family business. He read it the way he read briefing documents, quickly, retaining the essential facts, discarding the rest. He had no reason to prepare more than that. This was a preliminary meeting. He had chaired preliminary meetings with hostile takeover targets under more pressure than this. He dressed well, as he always did. He arrived at the private meeting room at the Kensington Hotel. Colin had booked neutral ground, appropriate level of discreet professionalism, precisely 4 minutes before the scheduled time. Colin was already there. The room had a long table, 2 chairs on each side, water and no windows, which Dominic did not mind. He sat down, adjusted the placement of his phone on the table, and waited. Mara Vance arrived with her father. Dominic stood. He shook Jeffrey's hand first, warm, practiced, the handshake of a man who understood the currency of small gestures, and then he turned to Mara. She was not what he had expected, though he would have struggled to say exactly what he had expected. She was slim, brown-haired, wearing a dark blazer that fit well and glasses that she pushed slightly up her nose as she sat down. She met his eyes for exactly 1 second before she looked at the table. Her handshake was firm and brief. She did not smile. He found that mildly interesting, and then stopped finding it anything and paid attention to her father instead, who was talking with the comfortable energy of a man who had decided to be in a very good mood. Colin guided the meeting. He explained the general framework of what was being considered, the timeline, the expectations, the discretion that would be maintained on both sides. He was clear that nothing was being decided today. This was an introduction. Dominic asked 2 questions. He asked Mara about her background. She answered concisely, without padding. He asked whether she had concerns about the arrangement. She said she had some, and that she expected to see more details in writing before forming a clear opinion. He noted the answer. It was more direct than he had expected. His phone rang. He answered it. He handled the matter in under 3 minutes, then set the phone face down on the table. Mara was looking at the water glass in front of her. Not staring, just resting her eyes there, with the particular stillness of someone who was thinking carefully and had decided not to show it. He noticed the small crack in the left lens of her glasses. He noticed that her hands were very still in her lap. The meeting lasted 22 minutes. Afterward, in the car, Colin asked him his thoughts. Dominic looked out the window at the street moving past. He said she would be fine. She seemed sensible. She would not complicate things. Colin made a note. He said he would move forward with the paperwork. Dominic nodded and looked back at the street and thought about the earnings call he had rescheduled to make time for this meeting. He thought about the subsidiary filing that needed review. He thought about the 11 things he had to get through before the end of the day. He did not think about the crack in the glasses. He did not think about the still hands. He did not think about the 1 second of eye contact that had been, for reasons he could not name and did not try to, more direct than he was used to. He had found someone manageable. The process would continue. The clock was running and he had too much to do to stop moving. In the hotel room they had vacated, Mara sat for an extra 3 minutes after her father left to take a phone call. She sat in the chair where she had sat across from Dominic Ashworth, and she thought about the way he had answered his phone in the middle of the meeting without apology. She thought about the fact that he had read her the way he had probably read every document on his desk, quickly, efficiently, and without any particular curiosity about what was underneath the surface information. She thought about the small scar on his jaw that he touched twice when the phone rang. She picked up her bag, she stood up, she smoothed the front of her blazer and walked to the door. There was a lot she had not said in that room. She was good at that. She had been practicing it for years. The paperwork moved fast. That was the first thing Mara noticed, how quickly the machinery of this arrangement spun into motion once both families had agreed. Within 4 days of the hotel meeting, she had received a 40-page document from Colin Hale's office outlining the proposed terms of the engagement agreement. Not the marriage itself, just the engagement. There was a separate document for that. She read both documents at her desk in the back office of her father's company, with a mug of tea going cold beside her, and the sounds of the warehouse drifting in through the thin walls. She read carefully. She always read carefully. She had learned early that the most important information was usually buried in footnotes, in the language that sounded routine, in the clauses that were written to appear minor. She underlined 3 things in the engagement document and 2 things in the supplementary framework. She wrote her questions on a notepad in her small, precise handwriting, and then she sent them, without softening language, directly to Colin Hale. He called her back the same afternoon. She could tell he was slightly surprised. Perhaps he had expected the questions to come through her father. Perhaps he had expected fewer questions or softer ones. She answered his call at her desk, closed the office door and worked through her list. Colin was professional. He answered directly, which she respected. By the end of the call, 2 of her 5 concerns had been addressed in a way she found acceptable. She said she would need to see the revised language in writing before she signed anything. Colin said he would send it over. She thanked him and ended the call. Then she opened her laptop and typed the name Dominic Ashworth into a search engine, which she had been deliberately not doing for the past 4 days as a test of her own discipline. The search results loaded instantly. There were hundreds of them. She read for the next 2 hours. The world had a lot of opinions about Dominic Ashworth. The financial press called him brilliant and difficult in equal measure. Business profiles described him as a man who had taken his grandfather's company and multiplied its value by a factor of 4 in 8 years through a combination of strategic acquisitions, disciplined cost management, and what several writers described with varying degrees of admiration as an almost total absence of sentiment. One interview from 3 years ago, a long one, in a business magazine she had read in university, had a quote that she returned to twice. When the interviewer had asked him what he considered his greatest professional quality, he had said, "I don't confuse what I want with what the situation requires." She read the quarterly filings next. She had access to these because Ashworth Holdings was a publicly listed company, and its filings were available to anyone who looked for them. She pulled 4 years of annual reports and 2 years of quarterly statements, and went through them the way she went through all financial documents, methodically, column by column, looking not for what was reported, but for what the numbers implied about decisions that had been made before the reporting period. She found the company to be, on balance, well managed. The growth was real. The debt structure was intelligent. There was one subsidiary, a logistics operation based in the north of England, that showed signs of strain that the reports framed as temporary and that she suspected were structural. But this was a small concern against the broader picture, which was solid. She closed the laptop. She looked at the wall in front of her for a moment, where a calendar hung with this week's deliveries marked in red pen. She was not reading his company's financials because she was in love with him. She was not reading them because she was excited about this arrangement. She was reading them because she was about to tie her name to his, and she did not go into anything without knowing the ground she was standing on. That was simply who she was. She had been this way since she was a teenager. Since the first time she had found an error in her father's accounting records that no one else had caught, and had sat with the quiet weight of knowing something important that the people around her had missed. Knowledge was the only kind of safety she had ever fully trusted. The formal engagement announcement was a quiet affair which suited everyone. A statement was prepared by Dominic's communications team, 3 sentences precise, giving away nothing, and released on a Thursday afternoon when the news cycle was already busy with other things. The statement described Mara as a professional in the financial sector. It did not describe her as beautiful or young or any of the things that gossip columns would have preferred. It was, by design, uninteresting. The gossip columns wrote about it anyway. Mara read some of the coverage on a Saturday morning with her second cup of coffee. The descriptions of her were creative, given that almost no one in the press had a usable photograph. She had been careful about her social media presence, careful in the sense that she had very little of it. She had accounts that she had not updated in years, containing photographs of nothing more revealing than a sunset she had photographed on holiday and a picture of a meal she had thought was interesting enough to document. The press made do with what they had, which was mostly speculation. Several outlets noted that she was less publicly visible than might be expected for a woman in her position. One columnist, with the confidence of someone who had never met her, suggested this indicated she was shy. Another said it meant she was strategic. A third wrote a paragraph about Dominic Ashworth's previous brief relationship with a model whose name Mara recognized from the social pages, and the contrast this represented. She folded the tablet face down and went to make a third cup of coffee. Celeste came into the kitchen while she was doing this. Celeste was wearing a silk robe and had the slightly careful expression she wore when she was approaching a conversation she had prepared for. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her sister with large, sympathetic eyes. "How are you feeling?" Celeste said. Mara considered this question. "I'm making coffee." "How are you feeling?" "I'm worried about you." Celeste folded her hands on the table. "I want you to know that none of this was my idea." "I know." Dad was she paused, searching for the word, very confident about his decision. "I know that too." "You could still pull out of it, Mara, if you wanted to. There's still time. You haven't signed the final documents yet." Mara looked at her sister for a moment. Celeste was genuinely worried, she could see it, beneath the silk robe and the prepared expression. Celeste, for all her polished surfaces, was not a cruel person. She had simply been raised in the same house as Mara, which meant she had also been trained to believe that what their father decided was generally what happened. "I'm not pulling out," Mara said. "But..." Celeste, her voice was quiet but clear, "I'm not pulling out." Celeste looked at her for another moment, then nodded slowly. She seemed to understand, even if she couldn't say exactly what it was she understood. She got up and poured herself a glass of water and said something about plans for the afternoon and left the kitchen, and Mara stood at the counter with her coffee and thought about the question that sat underneath Celeste's worry. The question was, why are you doing this? It was a fair question. The honest answer was not a single thing. It was a combination of things that Mara had assembled, over the 4 days since the hotel meeting, into something that made sense to her even if it might not make sense to anyone watching from the outside. She was 24. She was good at her job and completely invisible in it. She was smart enough to know that her father would never promote her to the role her work actually deserved, because her father had a particular idea of what his company looked like, and she did not fit the image he wanted facing outward. She had been building her career in a space where her ceiling was set by someone else's limitations, and she had known for a while that this was not sustainable. This arrangement, whatever it was, whatever it would cost her, was a door. It was an unusual door, perhaps not the door she would have designed for herself, but it was an opening into a different kind of life than the one she was currently living. And Mara, who had spent her whole life solving problems from the inside of rooms she had not chosen, was not going to let a door pass without at least looking at what was on the other side. She was also, if she was honest with herself, curious about him. The kind of curious she could not entirely explain and would not have admitted out loud. She had read his interviews and his company's reports and the various profiles that the press had published, and she had assembled a picture of a person who was formidable and focused and almost certainly not easy to know. The conference room version of him, the 22 minutes, the phone call, the barely their attention, was not the whole picture. She knew enough about people who managed their outward expression carefully to understand that there was always more underneath. She did not expect this to be a love story. She was not naive about what she was walking into. But she had spent 24 years being underestimated by the people closest to her. Walking into a room where someone didn't know what she was capable of was not, for her, a frightening thing. It was almost familiar. The revised document from Colin's office arrived on a Monday. She read it that evening after dinner, cross-referencing it with her notes from the first version. Both of her remaining concerns had been addressed. The language was clear. The terms were, on balance, fair. She signed it. She photographed the signed pages, sent them to Colin electronically, and then walked to the kitchen for a glass of water. She stood at the sink and looked at the garden through the window. The garden was dark, and the light above the sink reflected faintly in the glass. She thought, this is the beginning of something. She did not know what kind of something. She was comfortable with not knowing. She had learned, over the course of her life, that the people who needed to know exactly how things were going to turn out were often the people who understood the least about how things actually worked. Things worked in patterns you couldn't always see from the beginning. You had to be willing to start without having all the information, and then pay very close attention to what arrived. She dried her hands on the kitchen towel. She went upstairs. She had a report to finish before Wednesday, and she had learned a long time ago that the work did not wait for your feelings to settle. 3 weeks after the document was signed, Dominic's office sent over a schedule of what they called pre-arrangement appearances. These were events, dinners, a charity gala, a business reception at which Mara would appear alongside Dominic in the weeks before the wedding date, which had been set for 9 weeks out. The schedule was attached to an email from Dominic's personal assistant, a woman named Grace who wrote with remarkable efficiency and never used more words than necessary. Mara looked at the schedule. There were 7 events in 9 weeks. She replied to Grace with 2 questions. What was the dress code for the charity gala, and was there a briefing document available for the business reception, since she would presumably be introduced to people she had not met and would prefer to have some background. Grace sent back the dress code within the hour. The briefing document, she wrote, was something she would look into. 2 days later, a briefing document arrived. It was thorough: names, company affiliations, relevant business relationships. Someone had prepared it carefully. Mara did not know whether Grace had done it herself or had requested it from another department, but it was good work and she appreciated it. She began, quietly and without telling anyone, to prepare. She knew the names of the major shareholders at Ashworth Holdings before the first event. She knew the company's recent acquisition history, its main competitors, the general shape of the concerns that analysts had raised in the last earnings commentary. She did not intend to walk into any room in Dominic Ashworth's world without knowing enough to hold her own in any conversation that found her. The first event was a dinner, 12 people, an Italian restaurant in Mayfair with the kind of low lighting that made everything look more significant than it was. Dominic was already there when she arrived. He was at the bar with a man she recognized from the briefing document as the company's CFO, a tall man named Oliver Crawford who wore his suit slightly too large and had a reputation for precision. Dominic turned when she came in, and his expression went through a very brief and very small adjustment, not surprise exactly, something closer to recalibration. She was wearing a dark red dress, her hair was down, her glasses, the same pair with the same small crack, were straight on her face. She had not dressed to impress him. She had dressed appropriately for the event and then stopped thinking about it, which was how she approached most things. He crossed the room. He said good evening and told her she looked well, in the practiced tone of a man who said things like that correctly without necessarily thinking about them. She said thank you. She asked how Oliver Crawford's Q3 review had gone, because she had read an analyst's note that suggested there had been some discussion in the market about one of their property holdings. Dominic looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. "You've been reading the analyst notes," he said. It was not a question. "I try to know what I'm walking into," she said. A very small pause. Then he almost smiled. He didn't quite get there, but the almost was there, visible for just a fraction of a second before his professional expression settled back into place. He guided her toward the table. He pulled out the chair beside his own without making it into a gesture. She sat down. Around her the conversation flowed and she moved within it the way she moved within spreadsheets, looking for patterns, listening for the thing underneath what was being said, knowing when to speak and when to hold back. She spoke twice during the dinner in ways that moved the conversation forward. She did not try to impress anyone. She was simply present in the room in the full sense of the word, which was something people noticed even when they couldn't name what they were noticing. On the way out, Dominic held the door. She thanked him. He said the evening had gone well. She said she thought so too. It was not a meaningful exchange. It was the surface of two people being professional with each other, but there was a difference in it compared to the hotel meeting. Something had adjusted slightly. She did not examine it closely. She noted it the way she noted things and kept it in the back of her mind where she kept everything that might matter later. She went home, set her bag down on the kitchen table and made tea. She sat with it in the quiet of the house and thought about the small adjustment in his expression when he'd seen her. The recalibration. It was the look of a man who had formed one expectation and found something else in front of him. She had spent most of her life being found where people had not thought to look. She was used to it. She was not, she realized, as resigned about it as she usually was. She finished her tea. She washed the mug. She set it on the rack to dry and went upstairs, and the house was quiet and the clock on the landing ticked, and somewhere across the city in a 31st floor apartment, she imagined someone else was also probably still working. She did not think about whether that was a bond or simply a coincidence. She went to bed. She had work in the morning. She had gone over the schedule again that night before finally closing her eyes, noting the next event was a Thursday charity gala where she would be photographed in public alongside Dominic for the first time. Press would be present. The coverage would be real. She thought about the analyst note she had quoted and the fractional change in his face when she had done so, and she thought, whatever else this is, at least it will be interesting. It was not a comforting thought exactly, but it was an honest one, and she had always preferred honesty to comfort. Comfort was what you settled for when you had stopped expecting more. She had not, despite all evidence that she should have, stopped expecting more. She turned off the light. Outside, London hummed on. The charity gala was on a Thursday evening in early November, and the photographs ran by Friday morning. Mara saw them before Dominic did. She was already at her desk at 7:30 when her phone began filling with notifications. Her father, Celeste, 3 colleagues she had not spoken to in months, 2 people from university she barely remembered, all sending her some version of the same link with some version of the same message. She clicked the link once, looked at the photographs, and then set her phone face down and went back to the spreadsheet she was working on. The photographs were fine. That was the only word she had for them. She and Dominic standing at the entrance to the gala venue, his hand very briefly at the small of her back. He had placed it there for exactly the length of time it took to walk through a door and no longer. She was wearing the dark blue dress she had bought for the occasion, and she was not smiling in the primary photograph, the one that most outlets had used, because the photographer had caught her in the half-second before she composed herself. She was looking slightly to the left of the camera, and her expression was the one she wore when she was thinking. The caption on a celebrity news website she did not normally read called her the mysterious new bride of business king Dominic Ashworth. A comment section she skimmed very briefly, which she immediately regretted, had opinions about her appearance, her posture, and her expression, divided between people who found her intriguing and people who thought she should have smiled more. She put her phone in her desk drawer and kept it there until noon. Dominic's morning was different. His communications team had flagged the coverage by 6 a.m. and sent him a summary, something they did for any news item that included his name, and he had read it at his breakfast table with the same expression he used for earnings summaries. He noted the volume of coverage, which was higher than he had expected for a simple charity appearance. He noted that Mara's previous absence from public life made her appearance more interesting to the press than it would have been otherwise. He made a mental note to discuss this with his PR team. He did not particularly think about the photographs themselves. He looked at them once briefly, in the way he looked at things that were relevant to the business of his life. He noticed that she looked composed. He noticed that she was not performing for the camera, which was, in his experience, rare. Most people, when they became aware of being photographed, did something with their face. She had not. She was simply there, looking at something the camera couldn't see. And the result was a picture that was more interesting than the standard gala photographs his team usually monitored. He closed the coverage file. He had a 9 o'clock meeting. What he did not know, could not have known, was that the photograph was already moving through the kind of digital territory that produced opinions faster than reason. By mid-morning, a lifestyle blogger with a significant following had written a piece calling Mara quietly magnetic. By afternoon, a fashion publication had done a breakdown of the dress she was wearing. By evening, there were enough searches for her name that his communications team sent him a second summary. Grace forwarded this to him at 6 o'clock as he was leaving the office. He read it in the elevator. He found it mildly interesting that a woman who had been entirely absent from public life 48 hours ago was now the subject of several thousand pieces of commentary, most of which described her with the word enigmatic. He thought, they have no idea what she is. He thought, neither do I. It was not a thought he had often. He usually knew enough about the people around him to have a working theory. He believed in working theories. They were more efficient than waiting for full information, which rarely arrived in a form you could trust anyway. You built a model from what you had, and you adjusted when the model failed. His model of Mara Vance was incomplete. He was aware of this in the same abstract way he was aware of small problems that had not yet demanded attention. He logged it and moved on. He did not think about it again until the following Tuesday. Tuesday was the business reception, the one she had requested a briefing document for. It was hosted by a private investment group, held in a room in the city that had been chosen for its size and its discretion, and it brought together 40 people who represented, collectively, a significant portion of the capital that moved through certain sectors of the British economy. Dominic went to these events regularly. He was comfortable in them. He knew the language of the room, the particular register in which serious money spoke to itself, understated and precise, never raising its voice, never showing the edge unless it needed to. He arrived with Mara. This was the first event where they had arrived together, from the same car, which was a small logistical progression that his team had arranged without much discussion. She had been at the Ashworth Holdings building for a 30-minute meeting with Grace beforehand. He had not organized this, Grace had, and he had not thought about it much until she appeared in the corridor outside his office at 6:15. She was wearing a dark jacket over a cream blouse and her hair was up. She had her glasses. She had a small notebook tucked in her jacket pocket that he noticed because no one brought notebooks to these events. He looked at the notebook. She noticed him looking. "I write down names," she said. "I can't remember 40 names from a briefing document without writing them down." "You wrote down 40 names?" 38 I already knew. He looked at her for a moment. He said, "All right," and turned toward the elevator. She fell into step beside him and they went down to the car, and the ride to the venue took 11 minutes, during which she looked out the window and he checked 3 emails, and neither of them said anything, and it was not, he noticed, an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who were both thinking about something else. He found this, again, mildly interesting. The reception was busy from the start. He moved through it the way he always did, strategic, measured, giving each conversation exactly what it needed. He introduced Mara at the first 4 conversations he entered, and she was correct in each of them, polite, brief, letting him carry the professional exchange while positioning herself as a listener. Then Graham Holt found them. Graham Holt was the managing partner of one of the investment group's major stakeholders, and he was the kind of man who tested people early in conversations to see what they were made of. He did not do this aggressively. He did it through misdirection. He would ask what seemed like a simple question and then listen very carefully to how it was answered, because the answer told him something about how the person thought. He had done this to Dominic the first time they met, 8 years ago, and Dominic had passed the test by answering directly and with the exact level of detail that the question warranted. They had got on well since. He did the same thing to Mara within 2 minutes of introduction. He asked her pleasantly what she thought of the current environment for mid-market acquisitions. It was the kind of question that could be answered broadly and safely, or answered with actual content, and the choice of approach revealed something. Mara did not hesitate. She said she thought the current environment was interesting for targets with clean debt structures, but that the financing conditions were punishing for anything that required bridging, and that in her observation the market was currently undervaluing certain logistics operations that had taken on strain in the last 2 years, but whose core infrastructure remained sound. Graham Holt looked at her. He looked at her the way he looked at people when they had surprised him, which was a rare event. He asked her what kind of logistics operations specifically. She named a sector. She gave 2 examples, neither of which were the Ashworth Holdings subsidiary, although Dominic felt a very distinct sensation when she spoke, because the criteria she had described applied to it precisely. Graham Holt laughed, not dismissively, genuinely. He said that was exactly where he had been looking. He asked her which data sets she was working from. She told him. The conversation ran for 12 minutes. It was, by the standards of this kind of event, a long conversation. During it, Dominic said almost nothing. He stood slightly to her left and listened to his future wife dismantle Graham Holt's follow-up questions with the clean efficiency of someone who had done their homework and trusted it. When Graham Holt excused himself, warmly, with a specific request that she would make sure to connect with his analyst before the end of the event, and moved away into the crowd, Dominic turned to look at Mara. She was looking at the room in front of her with her usual expression, which was calm and slightly assessing. He said, "You studied for this." "I read," she said. "There's a difference. Studying implies there's a right answer. I was just trying to understand the environment." "You told Graham Holt something that his own team hasn't landed on yet." She glanced at him. "Is that a problem?" "No." He looked at her for another second. "No, it's not a problem." He moved them toward the next conversation. But the evening had shifted slightly in a way he could feel even if he could not immediately name it. He had come to this event with a clear understanding of how the evening would run. He would conduct the professional business of the room, she would be present and appropriate, and they would leave with the optics satisfactorily managed. That was the plan, and Dominic liked plans because they kept things moving in the intended direction. The plan had not accounted for Graham Holt. Or rather, the plan had not accounted for what Mara would do with Graham Holt, because Dominic had not thought to account for it. He had not thought she would say anything that stopped a room-level conversation in its tracks. He had not built that into his working model. The model needed updating. In the car afterward, she looked out the window again. He looked at the city. The silence was the same as before, two people thinking about different things, except that he was now thinking about something that had changed in the last 3 hours, and he was not entirely sure how to categorize it. "The logistics sector," he said after 2 or 3 minutes. She didn't turn from the window. "You have one." "I have one. I read the annual report. I noticed the strain indicators about 6 months back. I thought it was structural rather than cyclical, but I didn't have enough context to be sure." She paused. "Tonight confirmed it." He looked at the side of her face. "How did tonight confirm it?" "The way Crawford reacted when I mentioned the sector. He knew I was talking about your subsidiary before I specified. He did the thing people do when something they've been worrying about gets named out loud in public. He very slightly changed his weight, foot to foot. Most people don't notice that." Dominic was quiet for a moment. He had noticed it too, but he had noticed it because he had been watching Crawford specifically. He had not expected anyone else in the room to be watching Crawford. He said, "Do you always watch people that carefully?" She turned from the window then and looked at him. She had an expression he hadn't seen before, not the calm assessment, something smaller and more direct. She said, "Don't you?" He did not answer. He looked out his own window. The car moved through the city, and the streetlights ran across the glass in long, even lines, and Dominic Ashworth sat in the particular silence of a man who had just been asked a question he was going to be thinking about for longer than he'd expected. When he got home that evening, he poured himself 2 fingers of scotch, sat down at his desk and did not drink it. He sat there for a while. He thought about the notebook in her jacket pocket. He thought about 38 names. He thought about what she had said to Graham Holt and the way she had said it, not to impress, not to be noticed, simply because it was what she had found when she looked at the data. He thought about the fact that she had told him, in the car, that she had been reading his company's financials since before they met. He thought about the 22 minutes in the hotel conference room, and the way he had decided she was manageable, and the particular smallness of that word now, sitting here in his chair with the scotch he was not drinking. He was a man who kept very careful accounts of business, of risk, of obligation. He was less practiced at the other kind of accounting, the kind where you measured yourself against something and found the measurement uncomfortable. He sat with it. He was not a man who avoided discomfort when he met it honestly. He simply had not expected to meet it here. He went to bed. The scotch sat untouched on his desk until morning, when his housekeeper moved it to the kitchen and poured it away. The next morning came gray and cold, with rain pressing flat against the city windows, and Dominic was on his first call by 7. He moved through the morning at the pace he always kept, relentless, precise, efficient. A call with the Singapore team, a budget review, an email chain about the North of England logistics subsidiary that had been ongoing for 2 weeks, which now had a specific weight to it that it had not had before. He replied to the email chain with 3 questions. The reply from his operations manager arrived within 20 minutes, detailed, measured, but reading between the lines, there was the quiet unease of someone who was not entirely confident in their own framing. Dominic read it twice. He forwarded it to Crawford with a note to schedule a dedicated session before end of week. Then he stopped. He held the email thread in front of him for a moment and thought about the fact that the flagging of this problem, the real and specific flagging of it, not the polite corporate hedging it had been wrapped in before, had happened because of a conversation at a reception, the night before, conducted by a woman who had read his annual report at a desk in her father's back office, and noticed something his own analysts had skirted around for months. He did not send Mara a message about this. He thought about it once briefly and then went back to his day. It was not yet the kind of relationship where you sent that kind of message. He was not sure what kind of relationship it was, or whether that was even the right word for an arrangement signed in duplicate and witnessed by 2 attorneys. But the thought sat in the back of his mind for the rest of the day, quiet and persistent, the way thoughts do when they haven't finished becoming something yet. Mara spent that same morning the way she spent most mornings, at her desk before anyone else arrived, working through the accounts with the focused energy that came most naturally to her in the quiet hours. She filed 2 reports, responded to a vendor query, and reviewed a contract clause that she had flagged 2 days earlier and that her father had signed off on without reading. She noted the clause, wrote a memo about it, and put the memo in his inbox with a highlighted section. She had been doing this for 3 years. He read about 40% of the memos. She had learned to prioritize which 40% she wanted him to read. At 11, she stood up and walked to the kitchen and made a cup of tea, and while the kettle was boiling she thought about last night and Graham Holt, and the specific feeling of a conversation that had gone exactly where she needed it to go. She thought about the car ride back. She thought about Dominic's face when she had said what she said about watching people, and the way he had looked out the window instead of answering. She recognized that look. It was the look of someone whose answer was yes, but who was not ready to say it out loud yet. She poured her tea. She went back to her desk. She had a report to finish, and 3 more days before the next event on the schedule Grace had sent, and she intended to use every hour of those 3 days productively. She was good at waiting. She always had been. The thing about people who moved fast and decided quickly was that they nearly always showed you who they were very early. All you had to do was be patient enough to watch. She typed, outside London went on raining. Somewhere across the city, an untouched glass of scotch had been quietly tipped away, and the man who hadn't drunk it was in a conference room asking questions that had a new urgency to them, and neither of them said a word to the other about any of it. But the ground between them had changed. Even if neither of them had named it yet, the ground had changed, and both of them, in their separate offices in their separate parts of the city, knew it. 7 weeks before the wedding, Dominic's mother requested dinner. This was not unusual. Eleanor Ashworth had maintained a standing habit of monthly dinners with her son since his father died, and she used these dinners the way some people used therapy, to organize what she was thinking and say what needed to be said with someone who would not pretend not to hear it. Dominic valued these dinners. He would not have called them emotionally significant, but they were the one standing appointment on his calendar that he never rescheduled. This dinner she had chosen a restaurant in Chelsea that she liked because it was quiet, and because the private dining room had good acoustics, which mattered to her because she was 71 and her hearing was not what it had been, though she would not have said this directly to anyone. She arrived first. She ordered a glass of white wine. She looked at the menu and put it down without opening it, because she already knew what she would order. Dominic arrived 6 minutes later, which was late by his standards and punctual by any other measure. He kissed her cheek, sat down, ordered sparkling water and looked at the menu. She waited until the waiter left. "I saw the photographs from the gala," she said. "I assumed you would. She doesn't perform for the camera. I noticed." Eleanor picked up her wine glass and held it without drinking from it. "I spoke with Patricia Vance this week. She tells me Mara has always been the quieter one, that she keeps things close." "That would be an accurate description." Patricia also said. Eleanor paused, setting the glass down carefully. that Jeffrey had not initially planned to put Mara forward. A silence settled over the table. Dominic had known this, in the oblique way that you know things about arrangements when the arrangements have been made by practical people on both sides. He had known that the eldest daughter had been the original candidate, and that something had changed that calculation. He had not thought much about it, because the arrangement had moved forward and the alternative candidate was not his concern. "Is that relevant now?" he said. "I'm trying to understand who she is," his mother said. "I think you should be too." He looked at her. Eleanor Ashworth was not a sentimental woman. She had raised him with the belief that sentiment was something you were allowed to feel privately and rarely displayed publicly, which was not cruelty but was sometimes indistinguishable from it. She was, however, a perceptive woman. She had spent 50 years reading rooms and people with the precision of someone for whom getting it wrong had always had real consequences. He said, "What are you actually asking me, Mother?" She looked at him steadily. "I'm asking whether you know what you're walking into." "I know what the arrangement is." "That's not what I asked." The waiter came and took their orders. The restaurant moved quietly around them, low conversation, the sound of glasses, the distant sound of the kitchen. When the waiter left, Eleanor said, "I want you to pay attention to her, not in the professional sense, actually pay attention." "I pay attention to everyone." "In the sense that is useful to you," she said. "I'm asking for something different." She looked at him for a moment. "I had a conversation with Patricia Vance in which she described her younger daughter as capable, self-contained, and I quote, never asking for what she needed because she'd learned it was simpler not to need it." The words sat on the table between them. Dominic was quiet for a moment. He thought about the notebook with 38 names. He thought about the conference room and the manageable he had chosen, which had seemed accurate at the time, and felt considerably less accurate every time he spent more than 15 minutes in the same room with her. "She's not what I expected," he said. It was more honest than he usually was about things he had not fully sorted through, and his mother heard it as such. Eleanor nodded once. "Good, hold on to that." 4 days after the dinner with his mother, a call arrived that was not on any schedule. It came from Graham Holt's office, routed through Dominic's PA to a direct line. Graham Holt wanted to know, as casually as possible, whether the woman Dominic had brought to the investment group reception was available to consult on a specific acquisition target that his fund was considering in the logistics sector. Dominic's PA relayed this. Dominic sat in his office chair for a moment with this information. He thought about what it meant, which was that Graham Holt, one of the sharper minds in his professional landscape, had spent 4 days thinking about a 12-minute conversation with Mara at a public reception, and had decided she was worth pursuing for a paid professional engagement. He called Graham back himself. "I appreciate the interest," Dominic said, in the measured tone he used for conversations that had subtext. "She's in the process of restructuring her professional commitments at the moment, so I can't speak to her availability." Graham laughed. "I knew you were going to say something like that." "I'm not saying no on her behalf. I'm saying I'm not the right person to ask." "Will you pass it along?" He said he would. He was not certain he would, but he said he would because the alternative was a conversation that would require him to explain something he hadn't sorted through yet, which was that the idea of Graham Holt hiring Mara Vance as a consultant produced, in him, a reaction he had not expected and was not comfortable naming. He ended the call. He sat in his chair. He thought, "She is going to be my wife." He thought, "I do not know what she wants." He thought, "I have not asked." That evening he did something he had not done before. He called her. Not Grace, not his assistant. He found her contact in his phone, which was there because it had been placed there weeks ago for logistical purposes and had not yet been used for anything that mattered, and he called it. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello," she said. Her voice on the phone had the same quality as in person, clear and direct and slightly careful, the voice of someone who chose words with some thought. He said he hoped he wasn't interrupting anything. She said she was working and that he wasn't. He appreciated the honesty of this, the acknowledgement that she was working, rather than the performative, "Oh, not at all, of course not," that most people offered. He told her about Graham Holt's call. He described it accurately and without editorializing. He said the decision was entirely hers. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not long, 3 or 4 seconds, but he noticed it as a thinking pause rather than a surprised one. "Can I ask you something first?" she said. "Yes. Why did you call me directly? You could have sent a message through Grace." He considered this. He could have. "I thought you deserved to hear it directly," he said. Another pause, different from the first one. He could not identify the quality of it exactly. She said, "I'll think about Graham's offer and let you know." He said that was fine. He was about to end the call when she said, "The Crawford Review, did you schedule the session?" He stopped. "Yes, Friday." "Good, a beat. The overhead ratios in the last 18 months suggest the structural problem is in the contract pricing, not the operation itself. If Crawford's starting with the operational side, it might take you longer to find the actual issue." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "How long have you been sitting on that?" "Since the reception," she said. "I wasn't sure if it was my place to say anything." He thought about what his mother had said, about not asking for what you need because you've learned it's simpler not to need it. He said, "It's your place to say anything you've worked out, always." The line was quiet for a moment, then she said, "All right," and then, "Good night, Dominic." He said good night. He ended the call. He sat in his office for another few minutes. Then he forwarded a note to Crawford with a specific instruction to begin the Friday session with contract pricing structures rather than operations. Crawford replied within the hour with a one-line message. "Interesting starting point, I'll pull the contract history." Dominic read it. He looked at the window and the city beyond it, and thought about a back-office desk in a building he had never been to, and a woman who had been holding relevant information quietly because she wasn't sure it was her place to offer it, because she had spent years in rooms where her place was something other people decided for her. He thought, that ends now. Not as a declaration, not as a resolution. Just as a fact, quiet and certain, settling into place in the way facts did when you finally looked at them properly. The following Wednesday, 2 more pre-wedding appearances were completed, a press photograph session arranged by his communications team, and a brief attendance at an industry award dinner. Neither was significant in itself. What was significant to anyone watching carefully was the way they moved in those spaces together. At the press session, the photographer asked them to stand closer. They did. She tilted her chin up slightly, not for the camera, just the way she carried herself, and he became aware of the exact distance between them in a way he had not been at previous events. The photographs were professional and clean, and showed 2 people standing correctly next to each other with appropriate expressions. At the award dinner, someone asked her a question about her background in front of a small group, and she answered directly, not the deflecting, modest answer that people often gave, but a clear description of what she had done and what she knew. He watched the group react to her. He watched the women in the group respond with immediate recognition of someone operating without pretense. He watched the men decide, slightly too late, that they should take her seriously. On the way back, he told her the Crawford session had run 3 hours and had produced a specific and actionable finding. She asked what the finding was. He told her. She listened and then said, "I thought so," not with any particular satisfaction, just in the tone of someone checking whether their analysis had held. It had held. He looked at her in the dark of the car and thought about the word manageable and how completely wrong he had been about what he was looking for, and how strange it was that the wrong choice had somehow, without his arranging it, turned into the right one. He did not say any of this. He looked at the window instead. But his mother's voice was in his head from dinner, quiet and clear. "Pay attention. Actually pay attention." He was paying attention. For the first time in a long time, he was paying complete attention, and what he was seeing was not what he had expected to find. It was considerably more. 3 weeks to the wedding. The clock was still running, but for the first time since this had all begun, time felt less like pressure and more like something he wished he had more of. He arrived home that evening later than usual and stood in the hallway of his apartment for a moment before removing his jacket. The apartment was exactly as he had left it, ordered, clean, every surface clear of anything unnecessary. He had lived this way for 15 years. He had always found it sensible, space for thinking, nothing in the way. He stood in it now and thought for the first time that it also looked like a place nobody actually lived, not in the full sense of the word, a place someone passed through and conducted their life in but did not inhabit. He had not noticed this distinction before, or had noticed it and not thought it mattered. He took off his jacket. He hung it up. He went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, just water, because he had not wanted scotch tonight and had not wanted to examine why, and he stood at the counter and drank it and looked at the well-ordered kitchen with all its clear surfaces and thought about a back-office desk covered in papers and an open spreadsheet and a cold cup of tea, and the kind of living that happened around work rather than between it. He thought, I have been very efficient. He put the glass down. He thought efficiency is not the same as being present. He went to bed. He lay in the dark for a while without sleeping, which was unusual for him. He was generally able to sleep without difficulty because he had learned early to put the day down when it was done, like a tool back in a drawer. Tonight the drawer didn't close properly. He thought about what she had said on the phone. I wasn't sure if it was my place. He had told her that she could say anything she had worked out, always. He had said it and meant it and then sat with the weight of what that meant, not just for her, but for what it said about the environment she had been in before, about the rooms where she had learned to be quiet about what she knew. He was going to be her husband. He was going to be, in some formal and legal and public sense, the person she was connected to from now forward. He had thought about this in terms of its structural requirements. He had not thought about it in terms of what it actually meant to another person, what it required, what it could cost, done wrong, and what it might look like, done right. He was not, he thought, a careless person. He was an efficient one, but lately he was finding that the line between those two things was thinner than he had assumed. He turned on his side. The city hummed outside. He did not sleep for another hour, which was long enough to finish the thought he had started and put it somewhere he could find it again. When he finally slept, it was without the restlessness. The thought had settled. It was not resolved, but it was in the right place in the front of his mind, where he put things that mattered. The next morning, Mara sent a message to Graham Holt's office. She did not consult anyone first. She wrote that she was available for a preliminary conversation about the logistics acquisition if he wanted to arrange it, and that she could provide analysis of the target within 2 weeks of receiving the relevant data. She noted her professional background clearly. Graham Holt's assistant replied within 3 hours to confirm a call for the following week. Mara wrote the reply, put her phone down, and went back to the spreadsheet. She did not tell her father. She did not tell Dominic. She filed the information in her mind under things that were hers and kept working. She had spent her whole life having decisions made around her and about her by other people. She was 24 years old, and she was about to enter into a marriage. She had not chosen the way people usually choose things, and she was doing it with her eyes open, and her mind clear and a very specific understanding that whatever else this arrangement was or wasn't going to be, she was not going to arrive at it as a diminished version of herself. She had tried that already. She had lived in the diminished version for 24 years, and it had never once felt like living. 2 weeks and 5 days to the wedding. The whole city was going on around her, ordinary and relentless, and in the center of everything she was sitting at her desk being exactly who she was, and for the first time in a long time that felt like enough. More than enough, it felt like a beginning. She finished the report she had been working on, printed it, and walked it to her father's office. He was on the phone. He waved at her without looking. She set the report on his desk, noted the memo from 3 days ago still sitting in his inbox unread, and went back to her own space. She sat down, she put her hands on the keyboard. She thought, in 17 days I will not be working in this office anymore. The thought sat differently than she expected. Not with sadness and not with relief, with a kind of clean clarity, the way a long equation looks when the final variable resolves and everything on both sides balances. She had been adding up to something for a long time without knowing what it was. Now she was starting to see the shape of it. 2 weeks before the wedding, Dominic's best friend arrived at his office without an appointment and sat down in the chair across from his desk with the particular ease of a man who had been sitting in that chair, or chairs very like it, for the better part of 2 decades. Marcus Webb was the company's COO and had known Dominic since university, long enough to have developed an immunity to the expressions most people found intimidating and the silences most people found impenetrable. He and Dominic had the kind of friendship that did not require regular maintenance because it had been built on something more fundamental than frequency of contact. They understood each other in the specific way of 2 people who had watched each other under enough pressure to know what the other person was actually made of. He sat down, loosened his tie, which he always did within 4 minutes of arriving somewhere, and said, You look different. Dominic was signing documents. He did not look up. Good different or bad different. Just different, like something is bothering you, except it's not the kind of bothering you're used to. Marcus stretched his legs out, crossed his ankles, and looked at the ceiling. Is this about the wedding? The wedding is in 14 days. Everything is on schedule. That wasn't the question. Dominic finished the page he was on, signed it, and set his pen down. He looked at Marcus. Marcus was looking at the ceiling with the expression he wore when he was pretending not to be paying close attention, which meant he was paying very close attention. She's not what I expected, Dominic said. Tell me what you expected. Someone manageable. Marcus moved his eyes from the ceiling to Dominic. He had the look of a man sitting with something he wanted to say but was deciding how much of it to offer. He said, "What does she know about the business?" "More than my department heads in some areas." Marcus was quiet for a moment. How? "She reads, she analyzes. She formed an opinion on our northern subsidiary 6 months ago that Crawford's team arrived at last Friday." Dominic paused. "She told me about it on the phone because she had been holding it because she wasn't sure it was her place." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "And that bothers you?" "Yes, because she was right or because she didn't say it sooner." Dominic did not answer immediately. He thought about the question, which was the right one, which was why Marcus was useful to have in this room and in his life. He said, "Because she learned somewhere that what she knew wasn't welcome, and that's going to cost her, and has been costing her." Marcus uncrossed his ankles and straightened up slightly. He looked at Dominic with a different kind of attention now, not the pretend casual ceiling attention but direct, measuring. "You like her," he said. "I don't know what I..." Dominic, Marcus's voice was even but firm, the voice of someone who had been through enough years of exactly this to know where it went. "You called her yourself. You redirected Crawford's session based on what she said. You are right now in your office 2 weeks before what was supposed to be a legal transaction, talking about her in a way I have never heard you talk about a professional matter." He paused. "This is not about the subsidiary." Dominic looked at his desk. He looked at the documents he had been signing, which were real and concrete and demanded specific information in specific boxes, and then he looked at Marcus. He said, "I don't know who she is." "You've been spending time with her. At public events, with schedules and photographers and 40 other people in the room." He leaned back in his chair. "I know what she does when she's performing function. I don't know anything about who she is when she's not." Marcus looked at him steadily, "Then find out. There are 2 weeks. There are 2 weeks now, there are decades after that." Marcus picked up his jacket from the arm of the chair. "Or there could be, if you stop approaching this like a compliance requirement." He stood up. He straightened his loosened tie minimally, which was the closest he came to neatening himself before leaving a room. He looked at Dominic one more time. "She agreed to this arrangement knowing she was a second choice," Marcus said. "She still showed up, she prepared, she did the work. That tells you who she is more clearly than anything you'd find out at a dinner party." He moved toward the door. "Stop scheduling appearances and actually talk to her." He left. The office settled back into quiet. Dominic sat in it for a while. He called her that evening for the second time. She answered on the second ring this time. He said, "I want to do something that isn't on the schedule Grace put together." A brief pause. "All right," she said. "Dinner Thursday. Not an event, not a photographed thing, not a professional gathering, just dinner." Another pause. "Why?" It was a good question. The kind of question he had noticed she asked when other people would have simply agreed. She asked for the reason, not the arrangement. He said, "Because Marcus told me I should talk to you, and he's rarely wrong about things." He heard something on the other end of the line that might have been a very brief, very quiet laugh. It was hard to tell. He found he wanted to hear it again. She said, "All right, Thursday. 7 o'clock, I'll send you the address." "Send it through Grace," she said. "She's more organized than you are." He looked at the phone for a moment. He said, "Fair point." He ended the call and sat there in the particular stillness of a man who had just been gently teased by someone for the first time in as long as he could remember, and had found it unexpectedly pleasant. Thursday came with cold air and clear sky, which was unusual for November in London, and which Mara took as neither a sign nor a coincidence, because she did not assign meaning to weather. She wore a dark green jacket over a black dress and her usual glasses, and she took a taxi instead of the car her father had offered because she wanted the 10 minutes alone to think without having to perform composure for a driver who knew her family. The restaurant was small, private, and had no listed menu online, the kind of place that existed for people who needed a room without photographers. She recognized it as a choice made with specific thought, not just to impress. She arrived at 7 minutes. Dominic was already seated. He stood when she came in. He held the back of the chair without making it into a ceremony. She sat down. The waiter appeared and disappeared with practiced invisibility. They were given menus and left alone, and for the first moment it was the particular silence of two people who were about to have a different kind of conversation than the ones they had been having and were feeling the edge of it. Dominic set his menu down without opening it. He looked at her directly and said, "Tell me something that isn't in any document." She met his eyes. She did not ask what he meant. She sat for a moment with the question and then said, "I wanted to be an architect when I was 14. I gave it up at 16 when I realized I was better at the numbers than the drawings, and I spent a long time being quietly resentful about that." He looked at her. "What changed?" "I started working. Once you're actually doing something you're good at, the thing you didn't get tends to fade, mostly." She tilted her head slightly. "Your turn." He considered this. He said, "I bought my grandfather's first office building when it came on the market 6 years ago. I paid market rate for it. I could have pushed below, the seller was in a weak position. I paid market rate anyway, and I've never told anyone I did that." She looked at him. Something shifted slightly in her expression, not the careful assessment she usually wore, something more open. She said, "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because I didn't know how to explain it without it sounding like sentiment, and I didn't want to be asked whether I was sentimental." "Are you?" He looked at her for a moment. "Yes, in certain specific directions." She held his gaze. She did not look away, and he did not look away, and the evening moved around them quietly, the soft noise of the room, the candlelight, the waiter returning with water they had not asked for, and neither of them reached for the menu because neither of them was thinking about the menu. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "In the hotel room, the first meeting, did you form an opinion of me in those 22 minutes? He was quiet for a moment. He could have hedged. He did not. "Yes." "What was it?" He looked at the table and then back at her. He said, "I thought you seemed sensible, that you wouldn't complicate things." She absorbed this without blinking. She said, "Were you right?" "About the sensible part," he said. "About the rest of it, no." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I formed an opinion of you too." "I know." "You know." "You'd already read 2 years of quarterly reports before we met. You'd done your homework." He met her eyes. "I was behind." She looked at him, and the restaurant was warm, and outside the city was cold and dark, and the weeks before everything changed were very short now, and she did the thing she almost never did in front of people she hadn't known for years. She smiled. A real one, not the appropriate ones she distributed at events. It started at the corner of her mouth and took a moment to arrive fully, and when it did, he registered it the way you register something you were not expecting and cannot look away from. "You've caught up," she said. "I'm working on it," he said. The waiter returned. They ordered. The conversation did not go back to the careful, formal register of previous weeks. It went somewhere else, something that was not light exactly, but was warmer than what they had had before, and honest in a way that surprised both of them a little, which is often how real things begin. He walked her to her taxi afterward. He stood on the pavement in the cold air while she put on her coat and said good night, and he said good night, and she got in, and the taxi pulled away into the dark street, and he stood on the pavement for a moment longer than was necessary watching the tail lights disappear into traffic. He turned and walked back to where his own car was waiting. His driver said nothing, which was one of the qualities Dominic valued in a driver. He sat in the car and looked at the city going by and thought about the architecture she had wanted to design at 14, and the building he had bought at market rate and never told anyone about, and the smile that had taken a moment to arrive and then been completely, unambiguously real. He thought, "I have 12 days." He thought, "I should not waste them." He did not waste them. The following 10 days ran differently from everything that had come before. The machinery of the wedding, the venue, the flowers, the guest list, the seating arrangements, the press management, hummed along in the capable hands of Grace and the wedding planner his mother had retained. He let it. He had approved the major decisions weeks ago, and the remaining details were not things he needed to direct. What he directed instead was his own attention. He called Mara 3 more times before the wedding, not for logistical matters, for conversation. He asked her things and she answered them directly, and she asked him things and he answered them the same way, and the calls were shorter than they might have been but more substantive than anything he had managed in the first 7 weeks of the arrangement. He learned that she drank her coffee black in the morning and with milk in the afternoon, a distinction she applied consistently, and explained as having to do with what the stomach could manage at different hours of the day. He learned that she read actual books, physical ones, and had opinions about them that she offered carefully but did not moderate once offered. He learned that she had a sense of humor that was dry to the point of near invisibility, and that she deployed it in the pauses of sentences, in the word she chose instead of the expected one, in the specific understatement she used when describing things that had actually been significant. She learned things about him too. She was paying attention, he could tell. She asked questions that assumed previous answers, which meant she was building something, adding to a picture. He found this did not make him feel observed in the uncomfortable way that journalists and analysts and strategic adversaries made him feel observed. It made him feel, instead, like the picture was worth building, like he might be more interesting to someone who actually looked than he had given himself credit for. There was one evening, 5 days before the wedding, when the call had lasted nearly an hour without either of them planning for it. They had started talking about a book she was reading, A History of Infrastructure, which she had picked up because a section on post-war industrial planning was relevant to analysis she was doing, and the conversation had moved through 4 separate territories and ended up somewhere neither of them had expected when it started. He had been standing at his window for the last 40 minutes without noticing he was standing. She had, she said, let her tea go completely cold, which she said with the specific resignation of someone for whom cold tea was a meaningful loss. When they said good night that time, there was a different kind of quiet in the line for a moment before it ended. Not the 2 people thinking about different things quiet, something else. He went to bed that night without difficulty. He was tired in the good way, the way of a day that had been fully used. On the Friday before the wedding, Mara went to the hairdresser for an appointment her mother had booked 6 weeks earlier. The hairdresser was calm and professional and did not try to make conversation beyond what was required, which Mara appreciated. She sat in the chair and let the woman do her work, and she looked at herself in the mirror in the straightforward way she always had, not with pleasure or dissatisfaction, just recognition. This was what she looked like. These were the features she had been given and had lived in for 24 years. She thought about the crack in her glasses lens. She had meant to replace it for months. She had replaced it 2 weeks ago, quietly, before the gala, not because anyone had mentioned it, but because it had been in her way for long enough. She had replaced it and put the new glasses on and gone back to work and not thought about it further. She thought about the 11 pre-wedding events she had appeared at. She thought about all the rooms she had walked into correctly, prepared, composed, knowing the names and the context and the relevant data. She thought about the dinner on Thursday and the question Dominic had asked, "Tell me something that isn't in any document," and the way she had answered it, and the way he had answered his own version of it back. She thought about the word manageable and how clearly she had understood, in that hotel conference room 2 months ago, that this was how he saw her. She had known it from the brief handshake, and the phone call he had taken, and the minute and a half he had spent actually looking at her face. She had filed it without anger, not because it didn't matter, but because she had been in rooms that looked at her that way for her entire life, and she had learned, without bitterness, that the room's first opinion was almost never the one that held. The hairdresser finished. Mara looked at herself again. Her hair was down, which she almost never wore it, and it changed the shape of her face slightly, made it more open. She thought, this is still me, just a version of me that other people haven't seen yet. She thought, that's fine. She thanked the hairdresser. She left a tip. She walked out into the cold November afternoon and stood on the pavement for a moment with the city moving around her, and she thought about a 31st floor apartment with clear surfaces and no clutter, and someone who had bought his grandfather's building at full market rate and never told anyone because he didn't know how to explain it without sounding sentimental. She thought, I know people by what they do when no one is evaluating them. She had been evaluating him since before they met. She had a very clear picture now, and it was a better picture than she had had any right to expect. She raised her hand for a taxi. She had 2 more things to do today, and then she was going home, and she was going to finish the book she was reading and let tomorrow arrive at its own pace. The taxi came, she got in, 2 days to the wedding. The city went past the windows in its usual way, indifferent and relentless and real. She was ready. The night before the wedding, Dominic could not find the right position in his chair. He had been sitting at his desk for an hour with a glass of scotch he did not drink, which was becoming something of a pattern he would have found worth examining if he'd had the mental space for it. He did not have the mental space for it. He had mental space for exactly one thing, which was tomorrow, and what tomorrow meant, and all the ways in which tomorrow had become, over the past 2 months, something completely different from what he had designed it to be. He had designed a transaction. He had designed something clean and bilateral and legally documented, something that satisfied a condition and allowed his professional life to continue without meaningful disruption. He had been very efficient about it. He had identified a candidate, proceeded through the appropriate stages, managed the public dimensions with appropriate care, and scheduled a wedding for a date that gave him comfortable margin before the clause deadline. He had not designed this. Whatever this was, this particular quality of his evenings in the last 2 weeks, the way he thought about the upcoming days with something that was not dread or obligation, but something considerably warmer and harder to categorize. He had not designed it and would not have known how to. Marcus had been right, which was irritating. Marcus was right often, and Dominic had learned over the years to factor this in, but it remained irritating on a case-by-case basis. He had talked to her, he had actually talked to her. And the result was that he was sitting here, the night before his wedding, in an apartment full of clear surfaces and ordered space, unable to drink his scotch because he was too occupied with thinking about a conversation they had had 5 days ago about a book on post-war infrastructure planning, of all things, and the particular way she had described the moment she had understood something in the text, a small animation in her voice that had arrived and then been quickly composed again. Like a feeling she had allowed before remembering to manage it. He picked up his phone, he looked at her name in his contacts. He thought about calling, which he did not do because it was 11:30 the night before a wedding, and calling would have been, as he privately admitted to himself, probably too much. He put the phone down. He thought about what the morning would look like. The schedule was precise, a timeline existed, prepared by the wedding planner and color-coded by category, with margins built in for traffic and for the particular unpredictability of large gatherings. He would get dressed. He would be driven to the venue. He would stand at the front of a room with 300 people in it and wait. He thought about waiting. He thought about the first time he had waited for her, the hotel conference room, 8 weeks ago, barely aware of what he was waiting for. He had been looking at his phone when she came in. He had looked up, registered a general impression, dark hair, glasses, dark blazer, and looked back at his phone before his attention had properly arrived. He had not, he could see now with full clarity, been in that room at all. He had been in the 20 things he had to do after it. He thought about standing at the front of the room tomorrow. He thought about the doors at the back of the venue and what would happen when they opened. He did not know exactly. She had been appropriately private about the specifics of the day, just as he had. He did not know what color she would be wearing. He did not know what she would look like walking toward him with the full deliberate weight of a public moment on her. He thought he very much wanted to find out. This was a new thought, not the kind of thought that had been driving this arrangement from the beginning, which had been structured and objective and had to do with timelines and inherited shares. This was a different kind of wanting, the kind that had a specific and personal object, the kind that lived not in strategy but in simple, plain human anticipation. He was surprised by it. He sat with the surprise for a while in the quiet of the apartment. Then he put down the scotch, got up, and went to bed. Not because he wasn't thinking about it anymore, but because there was nothing useful to do with it tonight, and he had always known when to stop forcing a question and simply let morning come. Across the city, Mara was at her desk. Not working, not exactly. The laptop was open, but the spreadsheet on the screen had not been touched for 40 minutes. She was sitting at her desk the way she sometimes sat there on late evenings, in the particular stillness that had nothing to do with productivity and everything to do with thinking. She had not expected to feel this way the night before. She had expected to feel the same composed readiness she had carried through the past 2 months, clear-eyed, prepared, decided. She was still all of those things. She was also aware of something else underneath them that she had been mostly successful at not examining directly until tonight. She was nervous. Not about the wedding itself. She had prepared for that the same way she prepared for everything, thoroughly enough that there were no remaining unknowns she couldn't manage. She was nervous about something that had no briefing document. She was nervous about the future, which was not an event you could prepare for in the same way. It was a long series of days she could not yet see, and in all of those days there would be this person she was still learning, and learning someone took time and attention and a willingness to be surprised, and Mara was good at many things, but being surprised was not comfortable for her. She thought about what he had said at dinner, in certain specific directions, the specific precision of that. He had not offered the large general claim, "I am a sentimental person," because that would have been inaccurate. He had offered the smaller, true thing, sentimental in certain directions, in the direction of his grandfather's building, in the direction of things he valued that he did not know how to explain. She opened a new page in the notebook she kept beside her laptop, a small, black notebook, always the same brand, always used for things she needed to write down to sort through. She wrote a single line, "The things that will be true tomorrow." She thought for a moment, then she wrote, "I know more about him than he knows I know. I know more about who he is than he intended to show me. I showed him more than I planned to. The gap between us is smaller than it was. I did not expect that." She looked at what she had written. She thought about the gap being smaller. She thought about the places where it would need to narrow further, the things she would need to learn, the ways they would have to figure each other out in the actual daily reality of sharing a life, not the arranged occasions of the past 2 months. She thought about the phone calls and the fact that she had let one of them run an hour without noticing. She thought about the dinner and the question she had not been able to resist asking, "Were you right about me?" and his answer, which had been honest in a way she had not expected. She thought, "I was not supposed to walk into this hoping for anything. I was supposed to be practical and clear-eyed and managed in my expectations." She thought, "I have been practical and clear-eyed. The managed expectations part has somehow, without my permission, become more complicated." She closed the notebook. She closed the laptop. She looked at the dark window and the faint reflection of the room in it, the desk, the lamp herself, slightly blurred. She thought, "He is going to stand at the front of a room tomorrow, and I am going to walk toward him. And I am going to know something he doesn't know yet, which is that I have been watching him very carefully for 2 months, and what I have found is not what either of us came here for." She turned off the lamp. She went upstairs in the dark. Her mother knocked on her door at midnight. This was unexpected. Her mother, Diana Vance, was a careful woman who respected closed doors and did not generally knock on them without announcement. But tonight she knocked quietly and waited, and Mara said, "Come in." Diana came in. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, in the careful way of a woman who had something specific to say and was deciding how to say it. Mara sat up. They sat together for a moment without talking. Then Diana said, "I want to tell you something I should have said when this started." Mara waited. "You didn't have to agree to this. I know you know that. I also know that saying it now is considerably less useful than it would have been 8 weeks ago." Diana paused. "Your father made a decision without consulting you, and I let him, and I have not been comfortable with that since it happened." Mara looked at her mother's silhouette in the dark. She said, "I know. I also know." Her mother started again. "I watched you over these past weeks, at the gala, at the photographs that came out afterward. I watched you in all of it." Mara was quiet. "You're not walking into this afraid," Diana said. "That's what I wanted to say. I thought you would be. I thought I would see fear in you and I would have to carry that, but you're not afraid." Mara thought about the notebook and what she had written in it and the comfortable gap that had been narrowing unexpectedly. She said, "No, not afraid." Diana nodded in the dark. She reached out and briefly put her hand on Mara's hand, a short, direct gesture, the way Diana did everything she did emotionally, in a small and complete action that said everything in the smallest space possible. "Good," she said. She got up. She went to the door. She said, "Good night." Mara said good night. The door closed. The room went back to quiet. Mara lay back on the pillow and looked at the ceiling where the faint light from the street made soft shapes. Not afraid. It was the right word. The only word she had for the feeling she was going to sleep with, and the feeling she was going to wake up with tomorrow and carry with her through every room and every moment until the doors opened and she walked forward. Not afraid, ready. something she had been building toward for 24 years, even when she hadn't known that was what she was doing. She closed her eyes. The city went on outside. A few miles away, a man she was going to marry tomorrow was also lying in the dark, also not drinking his scotch, also thinking about morning. Neither of them knew the other was awake, but they were awake in the same direction, facing the same morning, and morning, as it always did, was coming regardless. Morning came at 6, the way it always did, without ceremony. Mara was up before her alarm. She sat on the edge of the bed and placed her feet flat on the cold floor and breathed for a moment, one of the small rituals she had without knowing when she had acquired them. Feet on the floor, cold surface. The specific reminder that the world was solid and you were in it. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table in the quiet house while everyone else was still sleeping, and held her mug with both hands and watched the kitchen lighten through the window as the morning outside slowly gathered. She did not think about the ceremony. The ceremony would be what it would be. She was not afraid of rooms or cameras or the weight of public moments. She had learned over the past 2 months of events and appearances that rooms were manageable if you understood what was actually happening in them. What was actually happening in them was always simpler than what they appeared to be. Take away the clothes and the chandeliers and the watched feeling, and what you had was just people, looking at each other, trying to figure out what to do next. She thought instead about what came after, not the days in the abstract. She was not given to abstract thinking. She thought about the specific and practical reality of sharing a space with someone who thought in straight lines and fast conclusions, who had the particular habits of a person who had lived alone and worked constantly and made all their decisions without reference to another person. She thought about the process of 2 people learning each other's language, not just words, but the whole unspoken grammar of a shared life. She was good at learning language. She was good at paying attention to the thing underneath the said thing. She thought, sitting in the morning kitchen with her tea going warm in her hands, that this was perhaps her best quality, not the numbers, not the analysis, but the attention itself, the willingness to look at something until she understood it, and then to look further. He was worth looking at. She had established that clearly over the past weeks. She had found in him a person of more texture than his public surface suggested, more careful with certain things, more uncertain about others, more willing to adjust when he found he had been wrong than she had expected from a man who was almost never told that he was wrong. The tea finished, she washed the mug. She went upstairs to begin the business of the morning, and she moved through it in her usual way, precise, unhurried, knowing what came next and going to it without drama. Celeste knocked on her door at 8. She came in with the energy of someone who had decided that today was going to be emotional, and was prepared to carry the emotional weight for both of them if necessary. Mara looked at her sister in the mirror. She said, "I'm all right, Celeste." Celeste sat on the chair beside the dressing table and looked at her with the large eyes she had inherited from their mother and the particular expression she wore when she wanted to say something kind and didn't know where to start. She said, "You look beautiful." Mara looked at herself. She said, "I look like myself." Celeste laughed, a surprised laugh, brief and genuine. She said, "I meant both things." Mara looked at her in the mirror again. She thought about the months of back-office spreadsheets and the cold tea and the memos her father half-read and the years of competence that lived in invisible rooms. She thought about 38 names in a small notebook and a dinner where someone had asked her for something true. She thought, "I look like myself," and for the first time in a very long time, maybe ever, that felt like exactly enough. "Thank you," she said. Celeste reached over and straightened a small thing at the edge of her collar, a tiny, sisterly adjustment, more contact than they usually made, saying something neither of them would have said directly. Mara let her. It was a small gesture and a true one, and true things, even small ones, deserved to be received. The morning moved forward. Cars were arranged, flowers were gathered, the house filled briefly with the particular organized chaos of preparation, and then emptied again as everyone moved toward the place where the day was going to happen. Mara sat in the back of the car on the way to the venue with her mother beside her and the city going past the windows, and she thought of nothing in particular, which was itself unusual, and which she understood was the mind's way of telling her that the thinking was done and what remained was simply the living of it. The venue came into view, a converted estate that was grand without being excessive, chosen by a leaner Ashworth and approved by everyone without much discussion. She could see the cars lined up outside. the arrival of guests in their coats, the quiet management of the large and careful event. Her mother put a hand briefly on her arm. She put her hand over her mother's hand for a moment. Then the car door opened, and the world was immediate and real, and there was no more room for thinking, only for stepping out and moving forward. She stepped out, she moved forward. The morning was cold and bright, and the doors of the venue were tall and dark at the end of the path, and behind those doors was a room full of 300 people, and a man standing at the front of it, who she had been building toward without knowing it for 2 months. She walked. Dominic had been standing at the front of the room for 11 minutes. He knew it was 11 minutes because he was a man who tracked time without thinking about it, the same way some people track sound or temperature, a background awareness that ran constantly beneath the surface of whatever else was happening. 11 minutes. The guests were seated. The room was at capacity and very quiet, in the particular way of large gatherings that have settled into waiting. The officiant stood to his right. Marcus stood to his left, slightly behind him, and at one point Marcus leaned forward and said very quietly, "You look like you're about to chair a meeting." Dominic adjusted his expression. He looked at the back of the room. The tall doors were closed. The winter light was coming through the high windows on the side walls, the kind of pale clear light that November produced on its rare good days, and it fell across the rows of chairs in long, even patterns. He looked at the flowers, white, spare, elegant, his mother's choice, and the faces of 300 people who represented the full range of his professional and personal landscape. He saw Crawford and Graham Holt sitting 4 rows back, which was an interesting conjunction. He saw his mother in the front row, straight-backed and composed, wearing a deep charcoal jacket and the particular expression she wore when she was feeling something strongly and had decided not to show it. He realized, nervous. This was not a feeling he was acquainted with in professional settings. He had given speeches to auditoriums of shareholders and presented to hostile boards and navigated high-stakes negotiations across 4 continents, and in all of those situations he had been capable and certain and grounded in a clarity about what was required of him. He was good under pressure. That was one of the things people said about him most consistently and most accurately. This was not that kind of pressure. This was something different, more personal, more exposed, less amenable to preparation. He had prepared what he could. He had thought about what he was doing and why and had arrived at a clarity about it that was not the clarity he had had when this began. The clarity he had now was better. It was more honest. An honest clarity in his experience carried a certain anxiety with it, because it left less room for the comfortable distance of treating things as processes. This was not a process. The music changed. It was subtle. The string quartet in the corner shifted from the quiet background piece they had been playing into something more specific, something with a shape and a direction to it, and the doors at the back of the room opened. He looked. She had thought while the car was arriving that she would feel the need to compose herself at the doors. She had allocated room for that moment, a breath, a stillness, the particular act of assembly before a public thing. She had expected to need it. She did not need it. The doors opened. The room opened in front of her, long and warm, full of the particular hush of a large gathering directing its attention toward a single point, and she was the point, and she felt the attention land on her without anxiety, not because she was performing, but because she had stopped performing some weeks ago and had found that without the performance there was nothing to be nervous about. She was simply herself, walking into a room, toward something she had chosen. She walked the way she always walked when she was not thinking about walking, steadily, with her weight properly placed, not quickly and not slowly, but at the pace that the distance required. The aisle was longer than it had looked in the site visit. The flowers on the chairs were white, and she registered them briefly and then looked ahead. She looked at him. He was watching the doors when they opened. She saw his expression before he had arranged it, that fraction of a second, very brief, when the face registers something before the person decides what to do with it. She was good at reading that fraction of a second. She had been reading it in people for years. What she saw in his face in that moment was not what she had expected. She had expected the polished composure of a man who had managed everything about this situation with professional care. She had expected the controlled expression of someone in command of a public moment. She had expected, if she was honest with herself, some version of the 22 minutes in the hotel conference room, the present but not quite there quality, the partial attention. What she saw instead was someone who had been completely surprised. Not by her presence. He had known she would walk through those doors. Something else had surprised him, Something about the specific and actual reality of the moment, the full arrival of something that had been approaching for weeks and was now here. His expression had a quality she did not have a word for immediately and then found. He looked unguarded. She had never seen him unguarded before. She walked toward him. The room went past in her peripheral vision, rows of faces, the flowers, the light, and her attention was on his face, and his face was on her, and the distance between them was narrowing with each step, and neither of them looked away. The music was still playing. He heard it at a distance. He was watching her walk, and he was aware of several things simultaneously in the way that heightened moments produce: the room, the light, the music, Marcus behind him. And underneath all of that he was experiencing a very specific sensation that he did not have the habit of naming, and so sat with unnamed. She was wearing something dark and simply cut, not a white dress, not the elaborate confection that the occasion might have suggested, something that was very much her own choice and very much her own register. Her hair was down, the way it had been at the gala, and she had no jewelry that he could see except something at her ears that caught the light once. She had her glasses. She had decided, apparently and without announcement, to be exactly and completely herself, and the effect of this, the complete absence of performance, the absolute refusal to be a version of herself chosen for the occasion, was something he felt in the specific way of things that strike you as beautiful because they are true. She reached the front, she stood beside him. She was looking at the efficient, giving him a moment to manage what he was managing, and he used the moment to find his composure, which arrived reliably if slightly later than usual. The efficient said something. There was a response required, and he gave it. He heard his own voice from a slight distance, which was the strange effect of attention split between what was happening publicly and what was happening in the interior experience of actually standing here, next to her, with the whole formidable weight of what this meant settling over him. She turned to look at him when his portion was complete. She looked at him directly, the way she had looked at him in the conference room for that 1 second, full and clear, and without deflection. There was nothing in her expression that was performing for the room. She was simply present, and she was present with him, and he recognized this as something he had been moving toward for 2 months without exactly knowing it. He looked back, he held her gaze. In the front row, Eleanor Ashworth sat with her hands very still in her lap and her expression almost perfectly composed, and in the slight lift at the corner of her mouth, visible only to someone who knew how to read her, was something that had been absent from her face for a long time, something that looked a great deal like relief. The ceremony moved forward. Words were said that had been said at such occasions for centuries, words about commitment and partnership and the nature of the choice being made, and the words had the weight they always had in rooms like this, which was the weight of sincerity and intention and the particular seriousness of two people standing up in front of everyone they knew and saying, "This is what I mean." He meant it. That surprised him slightly, not the surface commitment. He had always intended to honor the arrangement that was not in question. He meant the more fundamental thing underneath it, the actual, personal, honest truth of standing here next to this specific person. She said what she said, and her voice was clear and did not waver. He said what he said, and meant it more than he had anticipated being able to mean it 8 weeks ago in a hotel conference room, where he had barely looked at her face. Then there was the ring. He had looked at the ring exactly twice since it had been selected, once to approve it and once when it was in the box at the jeweler's. He had chosen it based on a brief from Grace about what she wore, what she didn't, what the appropriate register was. He had not agonized over it. He put it on her hand and felt without any fanfare the weight of the act, a small golden thing on her hand, and how completely solid it felt. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked at him. The room was very quiet. The photographs happened. The formal ones, the informal ones, the ones directed by the photographer and the ones that people took themselves on their own phones. He stood beside her through all of them and they were correct in every photograph, composed, positioned, appropriate. In 2 photographs he was caught not looking at the camera because he was looking at her instead, which he did not notice until the photographs were sent to him 6 days later. In those photographs, his expression was completely unguarded in the way it had been when the doors opened. His team debated whether to use those images for the press release. They used them. Grace made that call, and he agreed with it when he saw the reasoning, which was that they were real, and real was valuable in a way that the composed ones were not. At the reception, she moved through the room with the same quality she had brought to every event over the past weeks, present, attentive, without performance. He watched her from across the room for a moment, talking to Graham Holt, who was looking at her the way he had looked at her at the investment reception, with the full, engaged attention of someone who knows they are in a conversation worth having. Marcus appeared at his elbow. He looked in the same direction Dominic was looking. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You should tell her." Dominic looked at him. "Tell her what?" "Whatever it is you're sitting here not saying while you watch her talk to Graham Holt." Dominic looked back at the room. He said, "It's a wedding reception. A good time for honesty, some would argue." He looked at Marcus for a moment with the expression that meant stop talking. Marcus took a small step back and did not stop talking in the particular way of someone who had decided that their work here was done and the rest was someone else's problem. Dominic finished his glass of water. He put it down. He crossed the room toward his wife. She saw him coming. She finished what she was saying to Graham Holt and turned slightly to include him in the space beside her in the way she always managed these transitions, smoothly, without drama. Graham Holt congratulated them warmly and moved away with the tact of a man who understood the geometry of the moment. They stood together in the room. The noise of 300 people was around them, warm and constant. He said quietly, "How are you?" She looked at him. She said, "Better than I expected." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "So am I." She held his gaze for just long enough that they both understood what they were actually saying, which was more than the words contained. Then she looked out at the room, and so did he, and they stood together in the middle of it, in the particular ease of two people who have stopped needing to explain themselves to each other. The reception went on. The evening gathered and then deepened. 300 people filled the room with their lives and their noise and their opinions and their affections, and in the middle of it all, two people stood occasionally side by side, and the distance between them was considerably smaller than it had been, and shrinking still. Late in the evening, when the formal portion of the reception had given way to the looser, warmer section of the night, when people had drunk enough to be themselves, and the music was less structured, and the tables had been pushed back to make room for movement, Mara found herself in conversation with Elena Ashworth. She had been aware over the past weeks that her mother-in-law was watching her. Not with hostility. Elena was not a hostile woman. She was a precise one, and precision required sustained attention to gather the information it needed. Mara had watched her watching and had not changed her behavior as a result. She was who she was in front of Elena as in front of everyone else, which was something she thought Elena noticed and valued. Elena had a glass of champagne she had not touched. She held it as though it were relevant without drinking from it, which struck Mara as something only a particular kind of woman could do convincingly. She said to Mara without preamble, "I want to apologize." Mara looked at her. She did not say "it isn't necessary" or "please don't," which Elena would have considered performative. She waited. "I was part of an arrangement that did not begin with your consent," Elena said. "I knew the circumstances under which you were put forward. I chose to proceed because I had a son who needed a wife and a deadline, and I allowed that to take priority over asking the right questions." She paused. "I should have met you before the hotel meeting. I should have spoken with you directly." Mara considered this for a moment. She said, "Would it have changed anything? I would have known sooner what kind of person you are." "And what kind is that?" Elena looked at her. "Inconveniently capable," she said, with the small, dry precision of a woman who had spent 70 years arranging her feelings into the most compressed language available. "And completely unwilling to be invisible." Mara looked at her for a moment. She thought about the back office and the memos half-read, and the years of quiet competence in rooms that had not wanted to see it. She said, "I've been invisible for a long time." "Not to anyone paying attention," Elena said. A beat of quiet between them. Mara said, "He's paying attention now." Elena looked across the room to where Dominic was in conversation with Crawford and two board members, standing in the easy, confident posture of a man in his own professional world. She looked at him the way only a mother looked at a person, with a knowledge of every earlier version of him stacked behind the present one. "He is," she said. "It took him longer than it should have. He comes by that honestly. His father was the same." She paused. "But he adjusts when he's shown something real. He's capable of it, more capable than he admits." Mara followed her gaze across the room. She thought about contract pricing structures and a redirected Crawford session and a call that had lasted an hour longer than either of them planned. "I know," she said. Elena looked at her. The champagne remained untouched. She said, "Good." That was the whole of it. Simple, complete, final in the way of a contract signed in good faith by two parties who understood the terms. Elena moved away with the ease of a woman who had accomplished what she came to accomplish and had no further agenda for the moment. Mara stood where she was for a minute. She looked at the room, the people, the light, the late evening energy of a celebration finding its natural end. She found Dominic across the crowd. He was still in the professional conversation, but his head had turned fractionally, and she understood from the specific angle of it that he was aware of where she was in the room without looking directly at her. She picked up a fresh glass from a passing tray. She was not a consistent drinker, but tonight called for something with a shape in the hand. She crossed the room, not hurrying. She arrived at the edge of his conversation, and he registered her arrival the way he always did now, with a very small adjustment, a slight inclusion of her in the space beside him, not for show but as a genuine and specific response. Crawford glanced at her and said something professional and pleasant, and she answered it correctly. The conversation moved and included her, and she contributed 2 sentences that shifted it slightly toward something more interesting, which was a habit she was beginning not to apologize for. At some point the conversation ended, and it was just the two of them standing in the room. The reception was winding down around them. People were gathering coats and saying their long goodbyes with the particular reluctance of a celebration that has gone well. He said, "How did you get on with my mother?" She looked at him. She said she apologized. He looked at her, alert. For what? For the way this started. She held his gaze. She didn't need to. But it mattered that she did. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's a good person," in a very compressed and not immediately obvious way. "I think she's exactly like you," Mara said. He looked at her. She held the look until he understood she was not saying this gently. She was saying it because it was true. He worked through the implications of it briefly, and then something in his expression settled, not discomfort but recognition. "Maybe," he said. "Definitely," she said. He looked at her for another moment and then looked at the room. The last of the guests were moving toward the doors. The flowers were still standing in the low light. The string quartet had packed away hours ago, and in their corner the chairs were empty. "We should go," he said. "Yes," she said. They said their remaining goodbyes, his mother, Marcus, a handful of others, and the goodbyes were warm and real, not merely correct, which was one of the changes in him she had watched over the weeks without drawing attention to it. He was warmer than his default setting when he was not performing efficiency. She suspected very few people had seen this. She had been seeing it for weeks. They left the venue. Outside, the November night had gone fully cold. He guided her to the car with the same brief, unpretentious care he had shown at every previous arrival and departure, and the car was warm and the city was outside the glass and the day was behind them now, the whole enormous, carefully managed, ultimately surprising day. They sat in the car in the quiet. The driver moved through the streets. Neither of them said anything for a minute, which was the good kind of silence, the kind that didn't need filling because both people in it were doing something useful. She said it was a good day. He looked at her. He said, "Yes, it was." She looked out the window. "I didn't expect to think that this morning." "Neither did I." The city went past. The lights of London did their usual evening work, running across the glass in long, bright lines. She thought about the morning and the kitchen and the cold floor under her feet and the cup of tea and the notebook. She thought about everything that had happened between that morning and this quiet car on this dark street. She thought, "I have been doing this for 24 years. Learning rooms, learning people, learning the shape of things from the inside. I am good at it. I am going to need to be." She thought, "That's all right. I have been preparing for this without knowing it." She looked at the city. He looked at the city. They went home. The first morning of their shared life began without incident. This was, in its own way, significant. She had thought about this morning in the weeks before, the first day of whatever came after the ceremony, after the reception, after the photographs and the goodbyes and the long drive home. She had thought about it with the same careful practicality she had brought to everything else. She had expected awkwardness. She had prepared for the specific social difficulty of two people who were still largely strangers to each other's daily rhythms, finding themselves in the same domestic space. What she had not prepared for was ordinary. He was up before her. She knew this when she came down at 6:30 because the coffee was already made and there was a mug on the counter next to the machine that had not been there yesterday, which was a domestic question she had not thought about, where the mugs lived, resolved without comment by its being left out for her. She poured coffee. She stood at the window of the kitchen in the apartment that was very ordered and very clean, and looked out at the city that was already moving, and drank her coffee black the way she always did in the morning. He came in 20 minutes later in the jacket that meant he was about to leave for the office. He stopped when he saw her, which surprised her, not the stopping, but the quality of it, the small specific adjustment of his expression that was not formal or professional but was simply noticing her, being present to the fact of her. He said good morning. She said good morning. He poured his own coffee and she thought he would leave immediately, which would have been fine. She understood his schedule. She had seen his schedule. She knew that his days were structured tightly from early and that the mornings were productive hours he did not waste. But he stood at the counter for a moment with his coffee and said, without looking at her particularly, "There's a good place 2 blocks north if you want breakfast. The coffee is better than anything I have here." She looked at him. She said, "You're not taking me there." "No, I have a call at 7. I'll find it myself. I'll send the address through Grace," he said. She looked at him. She said, "You're going to send me a breakfast recommendation through your PA. She's more organized than you are." "Yes, you've mentioned that." She looked back at her coffee. "Send it directly." A pause, then all right. He left. She stood in the kitchen and finished her coffee and thought about the mug left out and the coffee recommendation and the particular quality of those two small things, which were not romantic gestures in any conventional sense, and were therefore more interesting to her than romantic gestures would have been. They were the gestures of a person thinking about another person in the practical daily sense, the sense of existing in the same space, and adjusting to accommodate that fact. She had not been certain until this morning that he would make those adjustments. She was certain now. She went to find her coat. She sent him a message, not through Grace, saying she would find the breakfast place on her own and that the coffee recommendation had better be worth the conversation. His reply came back in 3 minutes. "It is. Also, there is a better second mug in the cabinet to the left of the machine." She looked. There was. She put the one from the counter back and took the better one and thought about a man who had noticed or anticipated and left the informational error in place for her to discover. She walked to the breakfast place and drank better coffee and read the news on her phone, and then walked back and started the first day of her new life. The first 3 months were a composition in learned geography. She was mapping him. She was aware of doing this and was not apologetic about it. Mapping was how she understood things, and she needed to understand this person she was now building her life alongside. She mapped his geography the way she mapped everything, carefully, without assumptions, adding detail as it arrived. He was a creature of pattern. This was not a surprise. She had anticipated it from the filings and the interviews, from the evidence of his home and his schedule. What surprised her was the texture of the patterns. He was more routine than she had expected in some ways and less in others. He made his own breakfast on Sunday mornings, which she had not anticipated, and made it with a seriousness of attention that was slightly comic and that he was entirely unaware of. He could not make decisions about food with any confidence. He was decisive about everything in his professional life, and stood in front of the refrigerator for 4 minutes before asking her what she wanted for dinner, which she would then answer directly, and he would immediately act on with complete efficiency. He brought work home. This was expected. What she had not expected was that he would, after the first 2 weeks, stop going to his study to do it and start doing it at the dining table, which meant they were often in the same room working in parallel. He did not do this because she was there. He did it because the dining table had better light. She understood this and appreciated the honesty of it. The fact that it happened to place them in the same room was a secondary effect, not a design. She set up a small space for her own work in what had been a spare room. She kept it organized in her own way, which was different from his. He was orderly because he believed clarity enabled speed. She was organized because she believed her best thinking happened when the physical space was not creating additional variables. The results looked similar from the outside and arrived by different logic, which she thought was probably a reasonable summary of how they operated in general. He started asking her questions, not about professional things. He had started that early, and they had moved quickly into a kind of easy consultation about professional matters that felt natural and unremarkable. He started asking her other questions, what she thought about something he was reading. what she thought about a decision he had made 5 years ago and was reconsidering, what she found interesting, specifically, about the infrastructure book she had been reading when they had the long phone call. He asked as if the answers mattered, which they did because he used them. She could see when a question she'd answered had landed somewhere and was being considered. She asked him things too. She found his answers were often shorter than the questions deserved at first and longer if she waited. She learned to wait. He was not being withholding, he was processing, arriving at what he actually thought, not what the question expected. He was more honest about uncertainty than she had expected. He would say, "I don't know," and sit with it, which was rarer in people like him than it should have been. 6 weeks into the marriage, a crisis arrived. It came quickly, as these things do, a sequence of events compressed into a single bad week. The Northern Logistics subsidiary had been the subject of the Crawford Review, and the review had produced a plan, and the plan had been in implementation for 2 months. Then a supplier relationship collapsed, not because of anything structural, because of a personal dispute between a regional manager and the supplier's account lead that had been insufficiently managed at the team level and had escalated to the point of contract termination. The resulting gap in the supply chain created a delivery failure that triggered a penalty clause in their primary client contract, and the penalty clause was large enough to be a material concern. Dominic found out on a Monday evening. His phone rang at 8:30 while they were both at the dining table working. He took the call, listened, and his expression went through the specific transition she had come to know meant he was managing something significant, not visible stress, just the slight tightening of focus that indicated everything else had been set down. He was on the phone for 20 minutes. She finished what she was doing and made tea and left a mug on the table beside him without interrupting. He acknowledged it with a glance and continued the call. When he hung up, he sat for a moment. Then he described the situation to her briefly and clearly. She listened. She asked 2 questions. He answered both. Then she got up, went to her room, came back with her laptop and a printed document, the contract pricing analysis she had done months ago, extended with additional work she had done privately in the weeks since. She set it on the table. She said, "The penalty clause is here, page 12. I think there's a mitigation argument in subsection 4. It depends on whether the delivery failure meets the specific definition of force majeure in the parent contract, which is distinct from the force majeure language in the service agreement. They are not identical." He looked at the document, he looked at her. He said, "When did you do this?" "Over the past weeks. I wanted to understand the full exposure." "You were doing analysis on our subsidiary contracts." "Our subsidiary contracts," she said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. She held the look not as a challenge, just as a statement of fact. This was their life. These were their problems. She had been trained her whole life to stay behind the door of the back office, and she was not going to do that anymore. He said, "All right." He pulled the document toward him. He read the section she had indicated. He picked up his phone and called Colin Hale. It was past 9 o'clock. Colin answered. Dominic described the situation and the potential mitigation argument, and said he needed a legal assessment of the force majeure language distinction by morning. Colin said he would have it. They worked until midnight. He ran the operational side, calls to the team, decisions about interim supply arrangements, management of the communication chain. She ran the contractual analysis, building out the force majeure argument into a formal document that could go to the legal team for review. At one point, well past 11, he set down his phone and looked at her across the table. He said, "You're very calm." She said, "Crises are just problems that arrived faster than expected. They respond to the same approach." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "I would have taken longer to find the force majeure angle." "You would have found it." Eventually, a pause, "not as fast." She looked at her screen. She said, "That's why we're both sitting here." He was quiet. She could feel, without looking at him, that the quiet had a specific weight, not uncomfortable, but full. The kind of full that meant someone was sitting with something they were about to decide whether to say. He said, "I owe you an apology." She looked up. "For the hotel meeting," he said. "For the first 3 minutes of everything that came after it, for the word manageable." She held his gaze. She said, "I knew what the word was." "I know you did. I also knew it was wrong." "I know that too." He looked at her clearly. "I was very efficient and very wrong, and I would like formally to correct the record." She looked at him. The room was quiet and warm and past midnight. The crisis was managed, or being managed, in the capable hands of people who had been called and directed. They were sitting at a table covered in papers that represented the work they had both done. She said, "Record corrected." He nodded once. She went back to the document on her screen. He went back to his phone. And the night moved forward, and the problem was handled. And when they finally went to bed at 1:30 in the morning, it was with the particular tiredness of people who had done something well together, which is different from ordinary tiredness in the specific way that things done together are different from things done alone. She lay in the dark and thought about the word manageable and how far it was from here. She thought about what he had said, formally, to correct the record, and the precision of it, the way it was not flowery or excessive but was exact and complete. She thought, he learns, he adjusts. When he is shown something real, he doesn't look away from it. She thought, I was right about that. She was glad she had been right about that. The morning after the crisis came grey and cold, as November mornings did in London, and she was down in the kitchen at 6 again with the better mug and the black coffee and the window full of city light. She stood there as she had stood that first morning, except this morning it was different because the apartment was no longer a space she was navigating carefully. It was a space she was beginning to know. She knew where the better mug was. She knew which counter had better light for reading. She knew that the small plant near the window was watered on Thursdays, and that someone had been watering it consistently because it was doing well, and she had not asked who because she already knew. She heard him before she saw him. The particular specific weight of his step in the hallway, she had not expected to learn that this quickly, the specific audio signature of him coming toward a room, but she had. She was good at things like that, paying attention to the small consistent facts of a person's physical presence in a shared space. He came into the kitchen. He looked at her. She looked at him. They both looked like people who had gone to bed at 1:30 in the morning and gotten up at 6, which they were. "Coffee," she said, and gestured at the machine. He made coffee. He stood at the counter across from her. They both looked out the window at the morning. He said, "Colin's assessment is coming in at 8. "I know, he copied me." A pause. "He copied you." "I gave him my contact information last night." She looked at her mug. "I hope that's—" "Yes," he said, "it's right, he should have had it already." She nodded. They were quiet for a moment. Outside, the city was doing its morning work, the particular efficient business of a place that did not wait. He said, "The Crawford session you redirected, the subsidiary analysis, the force majeure, you've been working on this for months quietly." "I work on everything quietly," she said. "I know," he looked at her directly. "I want you to stop doing that, stop being quiet about what you're working on." She looked at him. "You've said that before." "I mean it more than I meant it before." She held his gaze for a moment. She thought about the back office, about the memos in her father's inbox, about 24 years of quiet work in rooms that had not thought to look for her. She thought, this room is looking. She said, "All right." It was a simple thing to say. It was not a simple thing to mean. To actually mean it, to actually let the door between her working self and her visible self stand open, that was going to take practice. She had built the quiet in layers over years, and layers did not dissolve in a conversation, even a good one. But she had said all right, and she had meant it as a direction. A committed direction, not a performance. He nodded once. He finished his coffee. He went to get his jacket because he had a call at 7 and they both knew it, and that was the ordinary reality of the life they were building. She stood in the kitchen with the city in the window and thought about what all right meant. She thought about the Graham Holt engagement she had accepted, which was going well, which she had started 3 weeks ago, and had not made a great event of telling him because it had not occurred to her that it needed an announcement. He had found out when Graham mentioned it in passing at a dinner. He had said something afterward, in the car, that had been not quite an objection, and not quite approval, but something more complicated. The expression of a man who was still learning how to share a world with someone else. She had thought about it. She had decided to leave the Graham engagement as it was because it was hers, and she had started it, and it was going well. But she had started telling him things she was working on. Small things, then larger things. Not out of obligation, but because she had found, without expecting to, that telling him things was interesting. He listened differently from most people. He listened for what the thing implied about the larger picture, and his responses often landed on implications she had already identified. which was satisfying in the specific way that a correct equation is satisfying. And sometimes he landed on implications she had not considered, which was more interesting still. She was learning him, he was learning her. The geography between them was getting smaller and more detailed every week, and smaller geography was more specific, and more specific was better. She had always believed this. Colin's assessment came at 7:50. She read it on her phone over a second coffee. The force majeure argument was viable. There were conditions and it would require negotiation, but the contractual path was there. She sent him the summary before his 8 o'clock call, flagged to the relevant section, 2 sentences of her own analysis added at the bottom. He read it, she knew, because he replied in 3 words, "Yes, that's right." 3 words, direct, exact, no more than what was needed. She thought, I have been learning his language. She opened her laptop. She had her own work to do, the Graham Holt engagement was ongoing and she had a deadline this week. She was also, quietly, beginning to outline a proposal she had not yet discussed with Dominic, which was the possibility of a formal advisory role in relation to the Ashworth Holdings subsidiary restructuring. She had enough of the picture now to have real input, and a formal role would give her the standing to provide it without waiting to be asked. She had not decided yet whether to propose it or simply to start doing it and let the doing speak for itself, which was her usual method and had its advantages. She thought she might this time propose it first. Old habits adjusted slowly, but they adjusted. The morning went on, the day built itself around her. Somewhere in the building, he was in his study on a call, managing the aftermath of last night's crisis with the complete focused competence that was his natural mode. She was at the dining room table doing her own work, which was not the same as his work but was in conversation with it, informing it, sometimes correcting it in the quiet way of a person who noticed things and had decided to say so. This was their life. This was what it looked like from the inside, ordinary and specific and real, not the photographs, not the press statements, not the careful architecture of managed public moments. Just 2 people in a morning kitchen and a dining room table and the work of becoming genuinely known to each other. She thought, I did not expect to find this here. She thought, I am glad I looked anyway. The audit files were in a folder on her laptop that she had labeled with a date 6 months before they had met. He found them by accident, not snooping, that was not a word that applied to either of them. They were both too direct for the particular variety of sideways curiosity that snooping required. He found them because she had sent him a document reference in an email and the file path in the metadata showed the folder structure, and the folder name included the date and the Ashworth Holdings identifier, and he read it and sat with what he was reading for a moment before the meaning of it fully arrived. She had been doing a financial review of his company 6 months before the hotel meeting, 6 months before their engagement, 6 months before he had shaken her hand for 22 minutes and decided she was manageable. She had gone into the meeting already knowing considerably more about him and his company than he had known about her. He sat in his study with this for 10 minutes. He thought about the hotel room. He thought about the document he had been given, a single page, 2 paragraphs, age and education and current role in the family business, and how that had been his entire preparation for meeting her. He thought about a folder on a laptop with a date 6 months in the past, full of analysis she had conducted on him as she would conduct analysis on anything she was about to engage with seriously. He thought about the word manageable with a fresh and specific discomfort. He thought she knew going in exactly what she was walking toward. She had done the work. She had read the documents and formed her own assessment and arrived with the results of that assessment already in place, and she had sat across from him while he answered his phone and barely looked at her face and decided she would not complicate things. He had not told anyone about this discovery. He had sat with it in the way he sat with things that required thinking through before speaking. He had thought about it for several days. He thought about what it meant not as a breach. He had understood quickly that it was not a breach. She had been reviewing publicly available information and doing it in the most obvious and reasonable way possible. He thought about what it meant about her. It meant she had said yes to this arrangement not in ignorance of what she was entering into, not in the submissive acquiescence of someone who did not understand the terms, not because her father had arranged it and she had not known how to refuse. She had said yes in full possession of a careful, detailed understanding of the professional and organizational reality of Dominic Ashworth's world. She had done her homework. She had evaluated the ground and decided it was ground she could stand on. She had chosen this, with complete information, in a way that he had not, in a way that he, in his efficient and managed approach to finding a suitable candidate, had been entirely incapable of, because he had not thought her worth investigating. He was sitting with the full and specific weight of that when she came into his study. She came in because she was looking for a document she had asked Grace to send and thought it might have come to his desk instead. She stopped when she saw his face. She had learned over the months the specific register of his expressions, the professional ones, the thinking ones, the ones that meant something had happened that he was processing. This one was different. She said, "What is it?" He looked at her. He said, "I found the audit folder." A beat of silence. She looked at him steadily. She said, "Which one?" "The one dated 6 months before we met." She did not look away. She said, "I reviewed your company's public filings, annual reports, quarterly statements, analyst commentary. I also pulled the subsidiary structure and some available contract information from public databases. I wanted to understand what I was agreeing to." He said, "You started 6 months before the meeting." "I had time. I was thorough." He looked at her. She held the look without defense, without apology, without the softening that would have been easier and less true. She had done what she had done, and she was not going to pretend it was a smaller thing than it was. He said, "What did you find?" She tilted her head slightly. "About the company." "About me." She considered this for a moment. Then she said, "A person who made consistently intelligent decisions in his professional life, who had been described by every serious business observer who covered him as formidable in the ways that came easily and limited in the ways he hadn't worked at yet, who had a reputation for being honest, which I weighted more heavily than anything else, because dishonest people are harder to work with and not worth the time." He looked at her. "What ways hadn't I worked at yet?" She said, "The people ones, the ones that didn't have a measurable outcome." He was quiet for a moment. He thought about the conference room. He thought about Marcus saying, "You look like you're about to chair a meeting." He thought about his mother's voice, "Try to be a human being." He said, "Fair." She looked at him steadily. "It's not a criticism, it's an observation. You've been working at it since we met." He held her gaze. He said, "You were watching me work at it." "Yes, and evaluating whether I was making progress." "Yes, That's somewhat unsettling," he said. "Probably," she said. "I imagine it was also unsettling to realize I'd been reading your annual reports for 6 months." He sat back slightly. He said, "The hotel meeting, you sat across from me already knowing." "Knowing the numbers," she said, "not knowing you. But you knew more than I knew going in." "Yes, He thought about this. He said, "Did you form a good opinion?" She looked at him. The study was quiet around them. The city was outside the window, gray and busy, doing what it always did. She said, "I formed a considered one. There were things I liked about what I found, and things I wasn't sure about." "What were you not sure about?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Whether you were capable of the adjustment, whether someone who had been operating the way you operated, efficiently, with minimal regard for what wasn't immediately measurable, could recalibrate when the situation asked for something different." He said, "And?" She met his eyes. "And I was right to be uncertain. You could have gone either way. A lot of people in your position would have stayed exactly where they were." "But I didn't," he said. "No. Because of you." She shook her head. "Because of yourself, I was just," she paused, finding the right word, "present enough to create the conditions for it." He looked at her for a long moment. The study was very quiet. Outside, the city hum carried on, always there, never stopping. He said, "I want to show you something." He got up. He went to the cabinet in the corner of the study, a low, dark wood cabinet that had been there since he moved into the apartment and that she had never seen open. He unlocked it and took out a folder. He brought it back to his desk and set it in front of her. She opened it. Inside were photographs, old ones, printed on the thick paper of an earlier era, faded at the edges. A building. Small, 2-story brick with a sign above the front door she could not read clearly in the photograph but that she recognized from context. She looked at a second photograph. A young man in front of the building, squinting in what looked like summer light, wearing the kind of suit that dated the photograph firmly to the 1970s. She looked at Dominic. He said, "That's the first office, Manchester. My grandfather built the company from 2 rooms on the ground floor." He paused. I have every photograph that was taken of that building over the years, every one they ever found. She looked at the folder, there were many photographs. She said, you told me at dinner you bought the building. 6 years ago, he sat down, I have the deed in here too. She looked at the folder and then at him. She said, why are you showing me this? He said, because you showed me everything you were working on before I asked. You showed me what you knew. You showed me what you could do repeatedly in rooms where I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking at yet. He paused. I want to show you things too, things that aren't in any document. She looked at the folder. She looked at the photographs of a small brick building in Manchester and a young man squinting in summer light. She thought about what he had said at dinner months ago, a sentiment, but in specific directions. She thought, this is one of the directions. She said, tell me about him. He looked at her, my grandfather. Yes. He sat back, he said, he was the most honest person I have ever known, not in a comfortable way, in the way that costs something. He would tell you exactly what he thought and exactly what he expected, and he expected a great deal, and if you met the expectation he never mentioned it because he had expected you to meet it. And if you didn't, he paused. He would tell you so, specifically and without cruelty, just as a fact that needed correcting. She was quiet, listening. He died when I was 22, Dominic said. I had just finished at university. I came home and he was in the hospital and I sat with him for 3 days and he talked when he could and sometimes he couldn't. In the times when he could, he stopped. He looked at the desk. He said he told me things he had never told anyone, about what he regretted. About the cost of running a company the way he had run one, what it required of a person, what it took from them. Mara was very still. He told me to find someone worth being honest with. Dominic looked at her. He said that was the only thing that made the rest of it sustainable, having a person you didn't have to manage. The room was quiet. She held his gaze. She thought about the clause in the will, the marriage clause, the legal mechanism that had set this entire chain of events in motion, and she thought about the fact that it had come from him, from an old man in a hospital bed telling a 22-year-old what mattered. She said, he put it in the will. He put it in the will. She looked at the photographs. She looked at the young man squinting in summer light, who had built something from 2 rooms and a clear idea of what he expected, and who had known, at the end, what the whole thing had cost. She said he was right. Dominic looked at her, which part? The finding someone worth being honest with. She met his eyes. That's the only part that was right from the beginning. The rest of it, she gestured, a small movement that encompassed the will and the clause and the hotel meeting and all of it, was just mechanism. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face had the quality of the unguarded moment at the ceremony, the doors opening moment, except quieter and more settled, less surprise and more recognition. He said, my grandfather would have liked you. She said, he sounds like someone I would have liked. He nodded. He looked at the photographs for a moment. Then he closed the folder and put it on the desk between them, and they sat in the quiet study on a grey London afternoon, and neither of them said anything for a minute, which was the good kind of silence, the kind that meant the important things had been said and the rest was simply present. She thought about the audit folder on her laptop and the folder on his desk and the distance between 6 months of quiet analysis and a cabinet full of old photographs, and she thought, we have both been doing this, preparing, building a picture, carrying things we did not know the other person would want to see. She thought, we are both still showing each other. She looked at him and he was looking at the desk, and the moment was ordinary and very true, and she thought, there are going to be so many moments like this. Small, specific, unannounced, the actual content of a shared life. She thought, I am glad I did not say no. She had never, she realized fully for the first time, been glad she had not said no. She had been clear about her decision and committed to it and prepared for it and arrived at it honestly. But this was different from that. This was genuine gladness without reservation or qualification. She looked at the folder on the desk. She said, can I see the rest? He looked at her. He said, yes. He opened the folder again. She leaned forward. He turned the photographs so she could see them, one by one, and he told her about them. And she listened in the complete and specific way she listened to everything that mattered, and the afternoon went on around them. There were 23 photographs. She looked at each one. He spoke about most of them, a few he simply turned over without comment, and she understood that the ones without comment were the ones that cost something to look at and she did not push. She had learned over the months the texture of his silences. Some of them were thinking silences, and some of them were choosing silences, and some of them were the silences of feelings that had not yet found the words they needed. The last photograph was different from the others. It was newer paper, still sharp at the edges, colors still clear. It showed the same building from the first photograph, taken at a different angle, and in the corner of the frame, barely visible, was the edge of someone standing outside the front door. You could see one arm, the edge of a dark jacket. She looked at it for a moment. She said, "Is that you?" He said, "The day I bought it." She looked at the photograph and the edge of the jacket sleeve. She thought about the day he had described, going to the building, paying full market rate, not telling anyone because he did not know how to explain that it wasn't strategy. She thought about all the things a person keeps in a locked cabinet because they do not know how to carry them in the open. She looked at him. She said, "You should have told someone." He said, "I didn't know who to tell." She said, "Now you do." He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "Yes." She straightened, she sat back, she said, "Put it back. We can look at it again another time." She reached out and pressed her hand briefly on the closed folder, a small gesture, specific and complete, the same kind of gesture his mother had made at the reception, saying something without saying it. He looked at her hand on the folder and then at her. She stood up, she said, "I'm going to make tea. Do you want anything?" He said yes, and she went to the kitchen, and he sat in the study for a moment longer, with the folder closed on the desk, and the afternoon outside the window, and the faint sound of water running in the kitchen as she filled the kettle. He thought about his grandfather telling a 22-year-old to find someone worth being honest with. He thought about what that had meant when he was 22, when it had seemed abstract and theoretical, the kind of wisdom that applied to someone else's life. He thought about sitting at his desk for 16 hours during the subsidiary crisis, and a document appearing beside him that had already worked out the answer, and the particular feeling of that, not relief or dependency, but the feeling of being alongside someone who was running on parallel lines. He thought about 38 names in a small notebook. He thought about an audit folder with a date 6 months before they met, and the word that had followed that, thorough, said without pride or performance, just as a fact about how she approached the world. He got up and went to the kitchen. She was at the counter with 2 mugs and the kettle steaming. She had put in the wrong amount of tea, too much actually, because she always made it strong when she was in the kitchen at his apartment, because his tea supply was of a particular quality she had developed an opinion about, and she was going about it with the complete focus she gave everything, which was slightly comic when applied to a cup of tea, and which she appeared entirely unaware of. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked up, she said, "Stop looking at me like that." He said, "Like what?" She said, "Like you're filing something." He said, "I was." She looked at him for a moment, then she went back to the tea. She said, "File this, I take it with milk in the afternoons." "I know," he said. She stopped, she looked at him. "You know. You told me on the 3rd phone call." She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned back to the tea and took out the milk and added it without further comment, but he could see, from the angle of her shoulders, that something had changed slightly, had relaxed, or arrived at something. He moved to the counter beside her and took his own mug. She handed it to him without looking. He took it. They stood side by side at the counter with their tea, and outside the window the London afternoon was going about its grey and relentless business, and the apartment was warm, and the folder was on the desk in the study, and neither of them said anything for a minute. Then she said, "Tell me something else that isn't in any document." He thought. He said, "I read the same 4 books every year, the same ones in the same order. I have done this since I was 25. She said, "What are they?" He told her. She looked at the titles in her mind and then said, "I've read 2 of them." "Which 2? She told him. He said, "What did you think?" She said, "The first one, yes. The second one, I thought it was about something different from what it thought it was about." He looked at her. He said, "I think that every time I read it." She looked at him. "You read it every year anyway. It's useful to sit with something that's wrong in an interesting way." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Yes. That's exactly right." They stood at the counter and drank their tea, and the afternoon went quietly around them. And it was a Tuesday in January, and they had been married for roughly 8 weeks, and the conversation was about books, and they were side by side in a kitchen in the particular easy silence of two people who were no longer having to try. She thought, this is the life. Not the ceremony, not the photographs, not the crisis and the force majeure and the audit folder and the photographs in the cabinet. This, a Tuesday afternoon in a warm kitchen, side by side talking about books. She thought, I came here prepared for something different, something harder, something that required more management. She thought, I am glad it is this instead. She finished her tea. She said she was going back to the Graham engagement analysis, which needed 3 more hours before it would be ready. He said he had calls until 6. She went to the dining room. He went to the study. The apartment held them both, each at their work in separate rooms and in the same life. Outside, the city went on. Inside, without announcement or ceremony, two people who had come together by mechanism were becoming something else, something that had not been on any schedule, that had not appeared in any of the documents that Colin Hale had reviewed and stamped, that could not have been predicted from either of their personal histories. Something that was simply, honestly themselves. It was a Tuesday in February, when things became something they could not be taken back from. She had not planned it for a Tuesday. She had not, in fact, planned it at all, which was, for her, remarkable. She was a planner. She was the person who thought 14 steps ahead and had already considered the variables and had a prepared position before she opened her mouth. This was true professionally and had generally been true personally as well, in the limited ways she had allowed personal things to develop over the past 24 years. She had not planned this. She had come home in the late afternoon from a meeting with Graham Holt's team. The acquisition analysis had concluded, had produced a strong result, had generated the kind of word of mouth that Graham Holt, when pleased, generated for the people he worked with, and she had set her bag down on the kitchen counter and stood in the kitchen in her coat for a moment, not taking it off, just standing there in the warmth of the apartment. He was in the dining room. She could hear him, not the words, the rhythm of the voice, the particular pace that meant a call was concluding. She heard him say, yes, tomorrow, end of call courtesy. The sound of the phone set down. Then quiet. She took her coat off, she hung it up. She went to the kitchen and filled the kettle, and she was standing at the kettle when she thought the thing she had been not quite thinking for several weeks. The thought arrived without announcement and without fuss, which was how her truest thoughts had always arrived, not preceded by emotion or premonition, just there, accurate and complete, like a number that resolves when you've entered the right formula. She thought, I am in love with him. She stood at the kettle and held the thought. She did not examine it for error the way she usually examined things. It did not have any error. It was simply true, in the clean and irreducible way that true things were. She could trace the accumulation of it. She could, if she had wanted to, produce a document, a kind of annotated timeline from the 38 names in the notebook to the call that lasted an hour to the late-night crisis to the photographs in the locked cabinet. She could identify the specific moments where the accumulation had gathered toward this. She did not produce the document. She did not need to. The conclusion was already established. She thought this was not part of the arrangement. She thought, the arrangement has not been what I expected for some time. She made her tea. She added milk, because it was afternoon. She put the mug on the counter and stood with her hands around it and thought about what to do with this information. She was not afraid of it. That was the first thing she checked. She was not afraid of the feeling or its implications or the vulnerability of it. She had expected, if this moment ever came, and she had, honestly, expected it less than she expected most things, to find it frightening, to find the exposure of it difficult, the transparency of needing something difficult, because she had spent so long learning not to need things in rooms where needing was not safe. She was not afraid. She was, underneath the steadiness, something that she recognized after a moment as happy, a plain and specific happiness that had no agenda to it, no cost-benefit analysis, just the simple fact of a feeling that was good. She heard him come into the kitchen. She heard him stop. He said, "You're standing in your coat." No, the coat is on the hook now. She turned around. He was in the doorway in his work clothes, the jacket from the end of his day still on, the look of a man who has just finished something and has not yet decided what comes next. She looked at him. She thought about whether to say it. She thought about it for roughly 3 seconds, which was longer than most of her decisions took and shorter than any other person would have managed. She said, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her. He waited. because he had learned that she said things when she was ready and not before, and that waiting was the right response. She said, "I was not supposed to fall in love with you." He was very still. She said, "That was not the arrangement. That was not what either of us was doing, but I have been paying attention to you for 5 months and I have." She stopped. She picked the sentence back up. "I have found consistently that you are the most interesting person I have ever been in a room with. I have found that the arrangement we made has become something I would not choose to be without. I have found," she paused again and looked at him directly, "I have found that I love you." The kitchen was very quiet. He was looking at her with the unguarded expression, the same one from the ceremony, from the call that ran an hour, from the cabinet and the photographs. Except this was the fullest version of it, the deepest reach of it. She had said something he had not been prepared for, which was unusual, because he was generally prepared. Crossed the kitchen. He was 3 steps away and then he was in front of her, close enough that she could see the small scar on his jaw, the one she had noted in the hotel conference room as the thing he touched when he was impatient, and had watched carefully enough since to understand was not only impatience but any feeling that was rising in him and not yet formed, and his expression was fully open and fully present in a way that she had been watching arrive over 5 months, and was now here complete. He said, "You were not supposed to." She said, "I know." He said, "Neither was I." She looked at him. The kitchen was warm and the city was outside and the tea was on the counter going cold, which was a small loss she accepted, and she thought about the back office and the 22 minutes and the word manageable and the entire chain of practical and contractual and arranged events that had somehow, without anyone designing it, produced this moment in a kitchen on a Tuesday in February. She thought, "My grandfather told him to find someone worth being honest with." She thought, "Here I am." He reached out and put his hand against her face, briefly, the way you touch something you did not expect to have and are being careful with. She stood in it. She thought about all the rooms where she had been quiet about what she knew and what she needed and what she was capable of, and she thought about how completely different this room was from all of those rooms, and how it had become that different because they had both, separately and together, chosen to make it so. She said, "I did not want to need this." He said, "I know." She said, "I need it anyway." He said, "So do I." They stood in the kitchen in the late afternoon light, and neither of them said anything more for a moment, because the important things had been said, and what remained was not a conversation. What remained was everything after, the days and months and years of a shared life that had begun as a clause in a will and a manageable candidate and a hotel conference room and had become this. 2 people, fully known to each other, in a warm kitchen, in the real and irreversible country of choosing each other. 6 months later, at a lunch that Elena Ashworth had arranged with the practiced invisibility of a woman who arranged things without appearing to arrange them, she sat across from Mara in a restaurant in Chelsea, and they talked about a number of things that were not the things she had brought Mara here to say. At the end of the lunch, over coffee that Elena drank this time because she had decided this was an occasion worth marking, she said, "I want to tell you something I've been thinking about." Mara set her cup down. She waited. Elena said, "When I called Patricia Vance and asked about the Vance daughters, I made a practical decision. I was looking for someone who would fit the requirements and not disturb what my son had built." She paused. "I did not look for someone who would change him. I did not think that was something I could ask for or that was available." Mara looked at her. Elena said, "I was wrong about that." Mara said, "He changed himself." Elena looked at her steadily. "He did. With considerable assistance from the conditions you created." Mara thought about the audit folder, the 38 names, the contractor pricing analysis, the force majeure, the Tuesday kitchen. She thought about all the conditions and how quietly she had built them, one conversation at a time. She said, "It was a mutual arrangement." Elena almost smiled. "Yes," she said, "I suppose it was." She signaled for the check. She was, as always, paying. She looked at Mara one more time before they stood to go, and in her expression was the thing that Mara had first seen at the reception, that particular relief, quiet and complete, the relief of a woman who has spent a long time worrying about something and has found that the worry was unfounded. Mara thought about Dominic's grandfather in a hospital bed, telling a 22-year-old to find someone worth being honest with. She thought the advice was good, the method was impractical, the result was correct. She stood up, she put on her coat. Elena was already at the door. The photograph that ran in a business magazine that spring, a profile on Ashworth Holdings' restructuring and the successful resolution of the subsidiary situation, showed Dominic Ashworth in his office. He was at his desk looking at a document, and in the lower right of the frame at the dining room table visible through the open door was a woman with dark hair and glasses working at her own laptop, not looking at the camera. The photograph had not been staged. The photographer had captured it between the arranged shots, and the magazine's editor had chosen it because it said something the arranged shots did not. It said, "This is what the room actually looks like." Nobody in the editorial meeting had been able to say exactly why it was better than the others. They had agreed that it was and run with it. Mara saw it when the issue came out. She looked at the frame herself, out of focus, at the table in the background, and thought about visibility and invisibility and the difference between them. She thought about back offices and memos half-read and years of quiet work in rooms that had not thought to look for it. She thought about a Tuesday in February, and a kitchen and a man 3 steps away and then one. She thought, I am visible in this photograph because I was in the room, because I chose to be in the room. Not because anyone arranged it or allowed it, but because I walked in and stayed and did the work and did not keep quiet about what I found. She set the magazine down. She looked at the dining room where she had been sitting in the photograph. She picked up her mug. She went back to work. He came in an hour later. He looked at the magazine on the counter. He picked it up, looked at the photograph, looked at her through the doorway, the same angle, the same frame, but real and moving and present, and then he set the magazine back down and went to his study without saying anything. 3 minutes later, she received a message on her phone. It was from him. It said, "The photograph is very good." She replied, "I'm out of focus." His reply, "Still the best thing in it." She put her phone down. She thought about 38 names and an hour-long call and a locked cabinet and a Tuesday in February, and all the days between and all the days ahead, and the specific, unrepeatable fact of a life that had started as a mechanism and become, against all design, the realest thing either of them had ever walked into. She looked at the window. London was outside, hum and light and motion. She thought, I was not supposed to find this here. She thought, I found it anyway. She went back to work. The afternoon moved around her in the good and ordinary way of afternoons in a life that had found its shape. And the city went on, and the room was warm, and everything that was going to happen next was already beginning, quiet and real and entirely theirs. Spring arrived the way it always did in London, not with ceremony but with the gradual and patient accumulation of small changes. The light came in at a different angle. The air had a different quality in the morning. Trees that had been bare for months started doing the slow work of producing leaves, which they did without announcement, which was the correct approach. Mara noticed these things. She had always noticed the incremental, the gradual shift that most people only registered when it was complete. It was why she was good at what she was good at. You had to be willing to pay attention before the change was obvious. She had been paying that kind of attention to everything for the past several months. To the city, to her work, to the development of the subsidiary restructuring, to Graham Holt's next engagement inquiry that had arrived in April and was more complex than the first, and to him. To all the ways the specific geography of him continued to develop, the new things she found, and the old things she understood better with distance, and the particular ongoing work of genuinely knowing someone, which was not a project with a completion date. She had proposed the formal advisory role in March. She had written a 3-page proposal, direct and clearly reasoned, and she had sent it to him directly and waited. He had read it. He had sent it to Crawford with a 1-line instruction, implement as described. Crawford had sent her an email the following morning that contained more enthusiasm than she had yet seen from his department, which told her something about how long the team had been waiting for this kind of input from someone who had done the underlying work. She had started the formal role on a Monday morning. She had walked into a meeting room in the Ashworth Holdings building, not the board room, a working room, practical and direct, and she had sat down with Crawford's team and begun, without ceremony, to do the thing she had been quietly doing for months. The team had adjusted fast. This was one of the things she had not anticipated, the speed with which people responded when they understood that the input was serious and the analysis was real. She had expected more friction, more of the cautious navigation that she had experienced in her father's company, where competence was something that had to be managed around the people who were threatened by it. She had not found that here. She had found people who were relieved. She had sat with that word for a while, relieved. She thought about what it meant that a team would feel relieved to have competent input brought into the room. She thought about the subsidiary crisis and the months of half-management it had been subject to before the real problem was named. She thought about the patience required of people who know something is wrong and cannot make the case loudly enough for it to be fixed. She thought, I know what that feels like. She had built the work in a way that was clean and sustainable and hers, and it was going well. The article in the business magazine had generated 3 inquiries from other companies. She had not responded to them yet. She was thinking about what she wanted and what shape she wanted it to take, which was a new kind of thinking for her, not navigating constraints but actually designing from preference. She had not had much practice with this. She was finding it more difficult than constrained navigation and more interesting. She discussed it with Dominic one evening in April, a slow Thursday that had given them time they did not usually have during the week. She told him about the inquiries. He listened without interrupting, which was something he was better at than he had been in November. He asked 2 questions, both of which were the right ones. She said, I don't know what I want it to look like. He said, what do you want it to feel like? She looked at him. She thought about the Tuesday kitchen and the Crawford team and the Graham analysis and all the work she had done that had felt like the right work, the specific quality of occupying the space that matched her capabilities, without the ceiling, without the managed walls, without the need to stay quiet about what she found. She said, like this. He looked at her, he said, then build toward that. She thought about it, she said, it will take time. He said, that's fine. She looked at him across the table and thought about how completely different this was from the 22 minutes in the hotel conference room and the word manageable. And she thought about what it had taken to get from there to here, not just the time, but the specific choices, both of them, made repeatedly toward honesty instead of management. She said, you've changed. He looked at her steadily, he said, you've noticed. She said, I've been noticing since November. He said, I know, a pause. You've been keeping notes. She said, not written ones. He said, the unwritten ones are harder to argue with. She looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed, a genuine one, the kind that arrived without her managing it, which was still new enough to notice. He watched it arrive in the way he had watched things about her for months, with the complete and specific attention of a man who had stopped looking at what he expected and started looking at what was actually there. She thought, 6 months ago I told him I loved him in a kitchen in a coat. She thought, he is the same person and has become someone I know much better. She thought, I am the same person and have become someone he knows much better. She thought, this is how it works. This is what it looks like from the inside to actually do this. She said, I'm going to accept one of the inquiries. He said, which one? She told him. He asked one question about the structure. She answered it. He nodded once and said, it's a good fit. She said, I know. He looked at her for a moment. He said, you never second-guess yourself. She said, I do it before I decide, never after. He was quiet for a second. He said, I'm the same way. She said, I know that too. He looked at her, and in his expression was the thing she had come to know most clearly in him, the specific quality of a person who has been completely seen and has stopped flinching from it. He had flinched from it at the beginning, not from her specifically, but from the exposure of being known. He had been very good at managing what people saw and what they understood about him, and she had not let him manage it with her, not because she had been aggressive about it, but because she was too direct and too observant for management to hold. He had adjusted. He had chosen, each time the choice was available, to not flinch. She loved that about him. She loved it specifically and particularly, in the way she loved things that were the result of genuine effort. They finished the evening the way they finished most evenings, each completing what they were doing, arriving back in the same space without ceremony, the ordinary end of an ordinary day. She made tea later than usual. He read something on his phone and told her 2 sentences about it. She responded with 1 sentence that added to it. The kettle boiled. She poured. They sat at the table together in the easy familiarity of 2 people who had learned to be in a room with each other without needing to manage it. She thought about a will and a clause and a hotel conference room, and a word she had been handed that fit her badly, and that she had simply waited to be replaced by something more accurate. She thought it took time. It required patience and consistency, and the specific willingness to keep showing up as herself, even in rooms that had decided what she was before she arrived. She thought it was worth it. She looked at the window. Spring London was outside, the trees doing their patient incremental work, the light at its new angle, the city humming along in its relentless ordinary way. She looked at him across the table, reading his phone, unremarkable and completely familiar, and the person she had chosen and who had chosen her, and she thought about what it meant to have arrived here. Not at a conclusion, she was not interested in conclusions. Conclusions meant the interesting part was over, but at a real beginning. The kind you did not have until you had done enough work to earn it. She drank her tea. He put his phone down. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything, and it was, in the complete and specific and irreplaceable way of things that are actually true, exactly right. Outside, London went on. Inside, the room was warm. The life they were building was not finished and would never be finished, and was for that reason the most alive thing either of them had ever been in. She put her mug down, she opened her laptop, he opened his, they both went back to work. This was the life, this was what it looked like, and it was, without qualification or reservation or the shadow of how it had started, enough, more than enough. It was the whole real thing.